YouTube listeners. Welcome back to our podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of cultural comparisons. I'm Mira, and I'm super to be here today with my co-host, Leo.
What's up, everyone? It's Leo, and I'm ready to take on another amazing country comparison with Mira. Or should I say, I'm ready to be roasted by Mira?
Oh, Leo. I'm just kidding. Although, we did have a crazy situation happen between our last podcast and this one. I was trying to make breakfast, and I ended up setting off the fire alarm in my apartment.
That's amazing. Mira, I'm sure it was a real wake-up call for you. Get it? Wake-up call.
Oh, Leo. You're such a pun master. But seriously, it was a bit of a chaotic morning. I had to evacuate the building, and I was left standing outside in my PJs, wondering what to do next. Ugh.
I can just imagine the scene. You, standing outside in your PJs, with a fire truck pulling up, and the firefighters giving you a weird look. Whoa.
Yeah, something like that. But anyway, enough about my cooking disasters. We're going to talk about two fascinating countries that are often overlooked, Bhutan and Nauru.
That's right, Mira. And we're going to dive into the differences between these two countries, so you can make an informed decision if you're visiting, moving, or even marrying someone from one of these countries.
That's exactly right, Leo. And with the help of Jetoff, AI, our trusty sidekicks, we're going to provide you with a comprehensive guide to help you navigate the ins and outs of these countries.
Yeah, and don't worry, we'll be here to hold your hand through the journey. Or should I say, we'll be here to roast you with our witty banter.
Well, we'll see about that, Leo. But seriously, our goal is to provide you with the information you need to make a decision that's right for you. Whether you're a seasoned traveler or just starting to explore the world, we've got you covered.
So, without further ado, let's get started on our journey to Bhutan and Nauru. Buckle up, everyone. It's going to be a wild ride. Whoa.
And remember, our podcast is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Jetoff, AI, who are helping us power our travels and share our experiences with you. Thanks for joining us, and let's get this conversation started. To dive into the fascinating world of general safety and crime rates. Our first country, Bhutan, is known for its pristine natural beauty and strong emphasis on gross national happiness. But what about safety? I'm curious. Leo, how does Bhutan rank in terms of crime statistics?
Good question. Mira, Bhutan has one of the lowest crime rates in the world. In fact, it's often said that crime is almost non-existent in the country. But, of course, that's not to say it's a perfect utopia. There are some reported cases of petty theft and vandalism, mostly targeting foreigners.
That's interesting. I was expecting a more, let's say, sinister picture. But I guess that's the beauty of Bhutan. It's a country that's truly focused on the well-being of its citizens. I'm sure our listeners living in Bhutan would agree with me that the country's safety record is quite impressive.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the numbers. Bhutan's unique approach to law enforcement is also worth noting. The country has a small, well-trained police force that focuses on community-based policing and prevention. It's a very holistic approach that takes into account the country's cultural and social context.
That's a great point, Leo. And speaking of culture, I've heard that Bhutan has a very strong tradition of community service and volunteering. I'm curious, have you heard anything about the role of volunteering in Bhutan's approach to crime prevention?
Yes. Volunteering is a big part of Bhutan's culture, and it plays a significant role in community-based policing. In fact, many Bhutanese citizens are encouraged to participate in community service programs, which helps to build trust and rapport between the police and the community.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the benefits of volunteering in Bhutan. Perhaps we can even explore some of the amazing volunteer opportunities available in the country.
Absolutely. And while we're on the topic of volunteering, I'd like to ask our listeners, have you ever considered volunteering in Bhutan? If so, what motivated you to do so? We'd love to hear your stories in the comments.
Great question, Leo. And speaking of stories, I've heard that Bhutan has a unique approach to addressing crime, particularly when it comes to juvenile offenders. Can you tell us more about that? Leo?
Yes. Bhutan has a very progressive approach to juvenile justice, which focuses on rehabilitation and reintegration into society. The country has implemented a number of innovative programs aimed at reducing recidivism rates and providing support to young offenders.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the specifics of these programs. Perhaps we can even explore some of the challenges and successes of Bhutan's approach to juvenile justice.
Absolutely. And while we're on the topic of challenges, I'd like to ask our listeners, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing Bhutan's approach to crime prevention? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Great question, Leo. And speaking of challenges, I've heard that Bhutan has a very high level of corruption compared to other countries in the region. How does the country address this issue? And what are some of the measures being taken to prevent corruption?
Yes. Corruption is a major challenge facing Bhutan, and the country has implemented a number of measures to address this issue. One of the most significant initiatives is the establishment of an independent anti-corruption agency, which has been instrumental in rooting out corruption and promoting transparency and accountability.
That's great to hear, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the specifics of Bhutan's anti-corruption efforts. Perhaps we can even explore some of the successes and challenges of these initiatives.
Absolutely. And while we're on the topic of successes, I'd like to ask our listeners, what do you think are some of the most significant achievements of Bhutan's anti-corruption efforts? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Great question, Leo. And speaking of achievements, I've heard that Bhutan has made significant progress in reducing poverty and improving living standards. Can you tell us more about the country's economic development and how it relates to crime rates?
Yes. Bhutan has made significant progress in reducing poverty and improving living standards, and this has had a positive impact on crime rates. The country's economic development has also led to increased investment in education, healthcare, and social services, which has helped to reduce poverty and improve living standards.
That's great to hear, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the specifics of Bhutan's economic development and how it relates to crime rates. Perhaps we can even explore some of the challenges and successes of these initiatives.
Absolutely. And while we're on the topic of challenges, I'd like to ask our listeners, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing Bhutan's economic development and how it relates to crime rates? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Great question, Leo. And speaking of challenges, I've heard that Bhutan has a very unique approach to addressing crime, particularly when it comes to cybercrime. Can you tell us more about that, Leo?
Yes. Bhutan has a very progressive approach to addressing cybercrime, which focuses on education and awareness raising. The country has implemented a number of initiatives aimed at promoting online safety and security, including public awareness campaigns and training programs for law enforcement officials.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the specifics of Bhutan's approach to cybercrime. Perhaps we can even explore some of the challenges and successes of these initiatives.
Absolutely. And while we're on the topic of challenges, I'd like to ask our listeners, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing Bhutan's approach to cybercrime? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Great question, Leo. And speaking of challenges, I've heard that Bhutan has a very unique approach to addressing crime, particularly when it comes to domestic violence. Can you tell us more about that, Leo?
Yes. Bhutan has a very progressive approach to addressing domestic violence, which focuses on prevention and support services. The country has implemented a number of initiatives aimed at promoting awareness and providing support to victims of domestic violence.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the specifics of Bhutan's approach to domestic violence. Perhaps we can even explore some of the challenges and successes of these initiatives.
Absolutely. And while we're on the topic of successes, I'd like to ask our listeners, what do you think are some of the most significant achievements of Bhutan's approach to domestic violence?
So, let's talk about Bhutan and Nauru when it comes to political stability and social harmony. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the most striking difference between these two countries?
Well, I think it's the fact that Bhutan has a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary system, while Nauru is a republic with a president as head of state. It's like night and day, right?
That's a good point. Leo, but what about social harmony? I mean, Bhutan is known for its gross National Happiness Index, which prioritizes the well-being of its citizens. How does that compare to Nauru?
That's a great question. From what I've researched, Nauru has a very small population, so it's easier to maintain social harmony. But Bhutan's approach is really interesting. They have a unique system where the government provides free education, healthcare, and infrastructure to its citizens. That's a big deal.
I know, right? It's like they're saying, we're going to take care of you, and you'll be happy. But seriously, it's a great example of how a country can prioritize its citizens' well-being.
Exactly. And it's not just about the government providing services. Bhutan also has a strong cultural tradition of respect for elders and community members. That's something that Nauru could learn from.
I agree. And speaking of culture, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's possible for a small country like Nauru to adopt a similar approach to social harmony?
Well, I think it's definitely possible, but it would require some major changes to their system, and it would take time. Maybe our listeners can share their thoughts on how Nauru could improve its social harmony.
Oh, that's a great idea. Leo, we should definitely get some feedback from our listeners. And while we are on the topic of Bhutan, I have to say, I'm really fascinated by their approach to sustainable development.
Ah, you're a true fan of Bhutan, aren't you? But seriously, their approach to sustainable development is really admirable. They're one of the few countries that has managed to balance economic growth with environmental protection.
Exactly. And it's not just about the environment. Bhutan's approach to sustainable development also prioritizes the well-being of its citizens. They're really about the long-term effects of their actions.
That's what I love about Bhutan. They're really ahead of the curve when it comes to about the future. And I think that's something that Nauru could learn from.
Oh, I completely agree. And speaking of the future, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the potential for Bhutan and Nauru to collaborate on sustainable development projects.
Well, I think that's a great idea. But it would require some serious effort from both countries. Maybe our listeners can share their thoughts on how Bhutan and Nauru could work together to achieve their goals.
That's a great point. Leo, and while we're on the topic of collaboration, I have to say, I'm really impressed by the work that AI is doing in the area of sustainable development.
Ah, you're a true fan of Jetoff. Aren't you? But seriously, their work is really impressive. They're providing valuable resources and tools for countries to implement sustainable development projects.
Exactly. And I think that's something that Bhutan and Nauru could really benefit from. Maybe our listeners can share their thoughts on how AI can help these countries achieve their goals.
That's a great idea. Nira, and speaking of goals, I think it's time for us to wrap up this topic. But before we do, I just want to say that I'm really impressed by the level of engagement from our listeners. Keep sharing your thoughts and ideas, and we'll do our best to address them.
Oh, thank you. Leo, I completely agree. And before we go, I just want to say that I'm really grateful for the opportunity to discuss this topic with all of you. It's been a real pleasure. Dive into the economic conditions and cost of living in Bhutan and Nauru. We've all heard that Bhutan is a country that measures its success not by GDP but by gross national happiness. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever been to a country where the priorities are so different?
Actually, Mira, I have been to Bhutan, and it's fascinating to see how they put happiness above economic growth. But let's talk about the economic reality. Bhutan has a unique approach to tourism, which is a significant contributor to its economy. They limit the number of tourists to preserve their culture and environment.
That's a great point. Leo, and speaking of tourism, Nauru, on the other hand, is a country with a completely different story. It used to be a phosphate-rich island, but now it's struggling to find new industries to replace the phosphate mining. I'm sure our listeners living in Nauru would agree with me that the economy is a major concern.
Yes, Mira, Nauru's economy is indeed a challenge. The country relies heavily on foreign aid, and the phosphate mining has left the island with significant environmental and health issues. But let's talk about the cost of living. Bhutan, being a relatively expensive country, has a high cost of living index. The average salary in Bhutan is around $500 per month, which is quite low compared to other countries.
That's right. Leo, and in Nauru, the cost of living is also high due to the limited availability of goods and services. The country imports almost everything, which makes it expensive for locals. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think it's fair to say that Nauru's economy is more challenging than Bhutan's?
Well, Mira, I think it's a bit unfair to say that Nauru's economy is more challenging. While Bhutan's economy is certainly unique, Nauru's economy is also facing significant challenges. But let's talk about the job market. Bhutan has a relatively low unemployment rate, around 2%, which is impressive considering the country's limited resources.
That's a great point. Leo, and in Nauru, the unemployment rate is also relatively low, around 1.5%. But the job market is highly dependent on the government sector, which can be a challenge. I'm sure our listeners would agree that finding a job in Nauru can be difficult due to the limited job opportunities.
Yes, Mira, you're right. The job market in Nauru is indeed limited. But let's talk about the economic benefits of living in Bhutan. The country offers a unique opportunity for expats to experience a different way of life. The Gross National Happiness Index is a great way to measure the country's success. And it's an attractive aspect for tourists and expats alike.
That's a great point. Leo, and in Nauru, the economic benefits are also limited. However, the country's unique culture and natural beauty make it an attractive destination for adventure seekers. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. Do you think Nauru's unique culture and natural beauty can make up for its economic challenges?
Well, Mira, I think it's a great point to consider. Nauru's unique culture and natural beauty are indeed assets that can make up for its economic challenges. But let's talk about the cost of living in Bhutan. The country has a high cost of living index, and the average salary is quite low. I'm curious, Mira, how do you think expats can afford to live in Bhutan?
That's a great question. Leo, in Bhutan, expats can afford to live by taking advantage of the country's unique tourism industry. Many tourists visit there to experience the country's culture and natural beauty, and they often stay in luxury hotels and resorts. I'm sure our listeners would agree that the cost of living in Bhutan can be quite high due to the limited availability of goods and services.
Yes, Mira, you're right. The cost of living in Bhutan can be quite high. But let's talk about the economic benefits of living in Nauru. The country has a unique opportunity for expats to experience a different way of life. And the cost of living is relatively low compared to Bhutan.
That's a great point. Leo, and in Nauru, the economic benefits are indeed limited. However, the country's unique culture and natural beauty make it an attractive destination for adventure seekers. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think Nauru's unique culture and natural beauty can make up for its economic challenges?
Well, Mira, I think it's a great point to consider. Nauru's unique culture and natural beauty are indeed assets that can make up for its economic challenges. But Let's talk about the Gross National Happiness Index in Bhutan. The country's unique approach to measuring success is indeed a great way to attract tourists and expats.
That's a great point, Leo. And in Nauru, the Gross National Happiness Index is not as prominent. However, the country's unique culture and natural beauty make it an attractive destination for adventure seekers. I'm sure our listeners would agree that the economic conditions in Bhutan and Nauru are quite different.
Yes, Mira, you're right. The economic conditions in Bhutan and Nauru are indeed different. But let's talk about the job market in Bhutan. The country has a relatively low unemployment rate, and the job market is highly dependent on the tourism industry.
That's a great point, Leo. And in Nauru, the job market is also limited. The country's unique culture and natural beauty make it an attractive destination for adventure seekers. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. Do you think Nauru's unique culture and natural beauty can make up for its economic challenges?
Well, Mira, I think it's a great point to consider. Nauru's unique culture and natural beauty are indeed assets that can make up for its economic challenges. But let's talk about the economic benefits of living in Bhutan. The country offers a unique opportunity for expats to experience a different way of life.
That's a great point, Leo. And in Nauru, the economic benefits are indeed limited. The country's unique culture and natural beauty make it an attractive destination for adventure seekers. I'm sure our listeners would agree that the economic conditions in Bhutan and Nauru are quite different.
Yes, Mira, you're right. The economic conditions in Bhutan and Nauru are indeed different. But let's talk about the cost of living in Bhutan. The country has a high cost of living index, and the average salary is quite low. I'm curious, Mira, how you?
So, let's dive into accommodation options and quality in Bhutan and Nauru. I'm curious to know, Leo, what's the housing situation like in Bhutan? Are expats finding it easy to find a place to live?
Bhutan's a unique case. Mira, the government's strict policies on tourism have kept the country relatively untouched. As a result, accommodation options are limited, especially in the capital, Thimphu. But if you're willing to venture out, you can find some amazing traditional Bhutanese houses with stunning views.
That sounds fascinating. I can imagine the scenic views would be breathtaking. But what about the quality of these houses? Are they well maintained and equipped with modern amenities?
Well, Mira, you get what you pay for. The traditional houses are often simple, but they have a certain charm to them. And yes, they're well maintained, especially in the more touristy areas. But if you're looking for modern amenities, you might be disappointed.
I see. And what about Nauru? I'm sure our listeners living in this country would agree with me that finding accommodation can be a challenge. What's the situation like in Nauru?
Nauru's a different story altogether. Mira, the country's small size and remote location make it difficult to find suitable accommodation. But the good news is that the government's been investing in new infrastructure, including housing. So, while options are limited, there are some modern apartments available, especially in YRN, the capital.
That's good to know. Leo, but what about the cost of living in Nauru? I'm sure our listeners are curious to know how much it would cost to rent a place to live.
Now that's a different story. Mira, Nauru is one of the most expensive countries in the Pacific. And accommodation costs reflect that. Rent can be steep, especially in YRN. But if you're willing to venture out, you can find some more affordable options.
I see. Well, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. But let's move on to the next topic. What about the cultural aspects of accommodation in these countries? How do locals view expats living in their communities?
That's a great question. Mira, in Bhutan, locals are generally welcoming to expats, especially in the more touristy areas. But in Nauru, the community is smaller, and locals are more protective of their culture. So, expats need to be respectful and sensitive to the local way of life.
I understand. And what about the infrastructure in Nauru? I'm sure our listeners are curious to know how well developed the country's infrastructure is.
No, that's a challenge. Mira, Nauru's infrastructure is still developing, and it's not always reliable. But the government's been working hard to improve the situation, especially in YRN.
I see. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. But before we go, I want to ask our listeners, have you had any experiences living in Bhutan or Nauru? Share your stories with us in the comments below.
Great idea. Mira, and to our listeners, I'd like to ask, what do you think about the accommodation options in these countries? Do you have any recommendations for expats looking to move to Bhutan or Nauru?
And finally, if you're moving to either country, make sure to research thoroughly and plan carefully. It's not always easy, but with the right mindset and preparation, you can have a great experience living in Bhutan or Nauru.
Well, that's all for today. Folks, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Dive into the visa and immigration procedures for Bhutan and Nauru. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried to navigate the complex world of visas and immigration?
No, but I've heard horror stories from friends who've attempted it. Bhutan, for instance, is known for its strict policies. I've heard it's not easy to get a visa, even for tourists.
Exactly. Bhutan is quite particular about who enters the country. But, on the other hand, Nauru has a relatively straightforward process. I've read that it's one of the easier countries to get a visa for.
That's true. Nauru has a reputation for being a bit more relaxed when it comes to immigration. But I'm curious, Mira, have you ever had to deal with the complexities of visa applications in Bhutan?
Well, I've done some research, and it seems that the process can be a bit daunting. But I've also heard that the Bhutanese government is working to simplify the process for tourists. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have any of you had to navigate the visa process in Bhutan?
Yes. I've heard that the government is trying to make it easier for tourists. But I still think it's a bit of a challenge. I mean, have you seen the requirements for a Bhutanese visa? It's like filling out a novel.
I know, right? But, at least in Nauru, it seems like the process is a bit more straightforward. I've read that you can even get a visa on arrival in Nauru.
That's true. But I've also heard that Nauru has some strict regulations when it comes to immigration. You have to be very careful about who you're traveling with and what you're doing in the country.
I see what you mean. But I still think that Nauru has an easier process than Bhutan. I mean, have you heard about the high value, low impact tourism policy in Bhutan? It's really unique.
Yes, I've heard about that. It's a great policy, but it can also be a bit restrictive for tourists. I mean, you have to pay a pretty hefty fee to enter the country, and you have to be accompanied by a licensed guide at all times.
That's true, but I think it's worth it. The scenery in Bhutan is just stunning, and the culture is so rich and unique. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have any of you had the chance to visit Bhutan and experience its unique tourism policy?
Yes. I've heard that Bhutan is a great destination for adventure seekers. But I still think that Nauru has an easier process for tourists. I mean, you can even get a visa online in Nauru.
That's true. But I still think that Bhutan has a more unique and authentic experience to offer. I mean, have you heard about the Gross National Happiness Index in Bhutan? It's really fascinating.
Yes. I've heard about that. It's a great concept, but it can also be a bit confusing for tourists. I mean, you have to navigate a whole new system of measurement to understand what's going on.
I see what you mean, but I think it's worth it. The concept of gross national happiness is really innovative, and it shows that Bhutan is committed to prioritizing the well-being of its citizens.
I agree with you. Mira, Bhutan is a truly unique country, and its tourism policy reflects that. But I still think that Nauru has an easier process for tourists. I mean, you can even get a visa on arrival in Nauru, and the process is relatively straightforward.
That's true. But I still think that Bhutan has a more authentic and unique experience to offer. I mean, have you heard about the festivals in Bhutan? They're just incredible.
Oh, yes. I've heard about those. They're definitely worth experiencing. But I still think that Nauru has an easier process for tourists. I mean, you can even get a visa online in Nauru, and the process is relatively straightforward.
I see what you mean. But I still think that Bhutan has a more unique and authentic experience to offer. I mean, have you heard about the monasteries in Bhutan? They're just incredible.
Ah, yes. I've heard about those. They're definitely worth visiting. But I still think that Nauru has an easier process for tourists. I mean, you can even get a visa on arrival in Nauru, and the process is relatively straightforward.
Okay. I think we've made our point. Both countries have their unique challenges and benefits when it comes to visa and immigration procedures. But I still think that Bhutan has a more authentic and unique experience to offer.
Ah, I agree with you. Mira, Bhutan is a truly unique country, and its tourism policy reflects that. But I still think that Nauru has an easier process for tourists. I mean, you can even get a visa on arrival in Nauru, and the process is relatively straightforward.
I think we're going to have to agree to disagree, Leo. But I'm glad we could have this conversation and share our perspectives on visa and immigration procedures in Bhutan and Nauru.
Ah, I agree. Mira, it's been a great conversation, and I'm glad we could share our insights with our listeners.
So, let's wrap up this topic and move on to the next one. But before we go, I'm curious, have any of our listeners had any experiences with visa and immigration procedures in Bhutan or Nauru? Please share your stories and tips in the comments below.
Ah, yes. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more content on travel and culture. We'll be back with more topics and discussions soon.
Dive into the healthcare system in Bhutan. I'm sure many of our listeners are curious about this country's approach to medicine.
That's right. Mira, Bhutan has a unique approach to healthcare. Focusing on prevention and holistic care, they have a well-developed network of healthcare facilities, including hospitals and clinics, that provide quality medical care to the population.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this approach. Do you think this is a good way to manage healthcare? Or do you have concerns?
I think it's a great approach. Mira, the emphasis on prevention and holistic care is really innovative, and it's something that many developed countries could learn from. Plus, Bhutan's healthcare system is relatively well funded, which is essential for providing quality care.
That's a great point. Leo, but what about the access to healthcare in Bhutan? Is it available to everyone? Or are there still disparities in the system?
Ah, good question. Mira, while Bhutan's healthcare system is generally well developed, there are still some disparities in access to healthcare, particularly in rural areas. However, the government has made significant efforts to improve healthcare access in these areas, including the construction of new healthcare facilities and the deployment of mobile healthcare units.
I'm glad to hear that the government is taking steps to improve access to healthcare. But what about the quality of healthcare in Bhutan? Is it up to par with other countries?
Well, Mira, Bhutan's healthcare system has made significant strides in recent years, and the quality of care is generally good. However, there are still some challenges, particularly in terms of medical equipment and supplies. But overall, I think Bhutan's healthcare system is comparable to that of other countries in the region.
Okay, let's move on to Nauru. How does the healthcare system in Nauru compare to Bhutan's?
Ah, Nauru's healthcare system is quite different from Bhutan's. Mira, Nauru has a relatively small healthcare system, with limited resources and a shortage of medical staff. However, the government has made efforts to improve healthcare access, including the construction of a new hospital and the deployment of mobile healthcare units.
I'm curious. Leo, how does Nauru's healthcare system deal with the challenges of a small population and limited resources?
Well, Mira, Nauru's healthcare system has had to get creative in order to provide quality care to the population. For example, the government has implemented a system of community-based healthcare, where healthcare workers provide care in rural areas. It's a great example of innovative in the face of limited resources.
That's a great point. Leo, and what about the quality of healthcare in Nauru? Is it comparable to Bhutan's?
Well, Mira, Nauru's healthcare system has some challenges, particularly in terms of medical, equipment, and supplies. However, the quality of care is generally good, and the healthcare workers in Nauru are highly skilled and dedicated.
Okay, let's talk about the cultural nuances of healthcare in Bhutan and Nauru. How do the healthcare systems in these countries reflect the cultural values of the societies?
Good question. Mira, in Bhutan, the healthcare system reflects the country's emphasis on holistic care and prevention. The system is designed to promote wellness and prevent illness, rather than just treating symptoms. In Nauru, the healthcare system reflects the country's small size and limited resources, with a focus on community-based healthcare and mobile healthcare units.
I think that's a great point. Leo, and what about the patient experience in Bhutan and Nauru? What are the experiences of patients in these countries like?
Well, Mira, patients in Bhutan and Nauru generally have a positive experience, with high levels of satisfaction with the healthcare system. However, there are still some challenges, particularly in terms of access to healthcare and the quality of care in rural areas.
Okay, let's wrap up this topic. What do you think are the key takeaways from our discussion of healthcare in Bhutan and Nauru?
I think the key takeaways are that both countries have unique approaches to healthcare, with a focus on prevention and holistic care in Bhutan and community-based healthcare in Nauru. Both countries also have challenges, particularly in terms of access to healthcare and the quality of care in rural areas.
And what about the listeners? Do you have any questions or comments about the healthcare systems in Bhutan and Nauru?
Yes. I'm sure our listeners have some great questions and comments. Let's hear from them.
Hey there, travel enthusiasts. Today, we're exploring transportation infrastructure and convenience into fascinating countries Bhutan and Nauru. Let's dive right in and see how these countries compare when it comes to getting around. I'm Mira, and I'll be your guide through this conversation.
That's right. Mira. And I'm Leo, your go-to guy for all things transportation and travel. We're to share our insights on Bhutan and Nauru's transportation systems. From scenic roads to rugged terrain, we'll cover it all.
So, let's start with Bhutan. This tiny Himalayan kingdom is known for its stunning landscapes and unique cultural heritage. But have you ever tried to navigate its roads? It's like a roller coaster ride. Folks, the roads are steep, narrow, and winding, making it a thrilling experience for tourists.
That's an understatement. Mira, Bhutan's roads are indeed a challenge. But they're also a major tourist draw. Visitors love the scenic views and the opportunity to experience the country's unique culture firsthand. And let's not forget the iconic Taxation, also known as the Tiger's Nest Monastery, which is accessible only by foot or on horseback.
Exactly. And speaking of accessibility, Bhutan has made significant efforts to improve its transportation infrastructure in recent years. The country has invested in modernizing its roads, including the construction of new highways and bridges. This has made it easier for tourists to explore the country's many attractions.
That's right. Mira. And it's not just about the roads. Bhutan has also made strides in developing its public transportation system. The country offers a range of buses and taxis that cater to different budgets and preferences. Plus, with the rise of ecotourism, many travelers are opting for environmentally friendly transportation options like bicycles and horseback rides.
I bet our listeners in Bhutan relate to this traffic chaos. But seriously, Leo, how does Nauru's transportation infrastructure compare to Bhutan's? I'm curious to know.
Well, Mira, Nauru is a small island nation in the Pacific, and its transportation infrastructure is quite different from Bhutan's. Nauru has no airport, and the only way to get there is by boat. The country's main mode of transportation is by ferry, which connects Nauru to the nearby island of Tuvalu.
Well, that's quite a challenge. But I guess it's not all bad. I've heard that Nauru's ferry system is quite efficient, and tourists can enjoy the scenic views of the Pacific Ocean while traveling.
That's right. Mira. And despite the lack of an airport, Nauru has made efforts to improve its transportation infrastructure. The country has invested in modernizing its ferry fleet and has introduced new transportation options like speedboats and charter flights.
I see. And what about road quality in Nauru? I've heard that the country's roads are quite rough, especially outside of the capital city.
That's an understatement. Mira. Nauru's roads are indeed rough, but they're also a major challenge for the country's transportation infrastructure. The country's rugged terrain and lack of resources have made it difficult to maintain and improve its roads.
I bet our listeners in Nauru can relate to this. But seriously, Leo, how do you think Bhutan and Nauru can improve their transportation infrastructure to make it more convenient for tourists?
Well, Mira, I think both countries have made significant efforts to improve their transportation infrastructure, but there's still room for improvement. Bhutan could focus on developing its public transportation system and investing in more environmentally friendly transportation options. Nauru, on the other hand, could work on improving its road quality and investing in more reliable transportation options like speedboats and charter flights.
That's a great point. Leo, and what about traveler experiences? How can tourists navigate the transportation systems in Bhutan and Nauru?
That's a great question. Mira, both countries have unique transportation challenges, but tourists can navigate them with a little planning and flexibility. For example, in Bhutan, tourists can hire a guide or join a tour group to help navigate the country's roads and transportation systems. In Nauru, tourists can rely on local transportation services like ferries and taxis to get around.
I see. And what about transportation costs in both countries? Are they affordable for tourists?
Well, Mira, transportation costs in Bhutan are relatively affordable, especially when compared to other countries in the region. However, Nauru's transportation costs are quite high due to the country's remote location and limited transportation options.
I bet our listeners are eager to know more about transportation in Bhutan and Nauru. But seriously, Leo, what's the most important takeaway from our conversation today?
I think the most important takeaway, Mira, is that both Bhutan and Nauru have unique transportation challenges, but they also offer tourists unique and unforgettable experiences. Whether it's navigating the country's scenic roads or relying on local transportation services, tourists can have a safe and enjoyable journey in both countries.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Folks, thanks for joining us on this journey through Bhutan and Nauru's transportation infrastructure. If you've got any questions or comments, please share them below. And if you've got a better tip, drop a comment. I'm convinced that language barriers can make or break a travel experience. In Bhutan, for instance, the official language is Dongguk, but many locals also speak English, which is a great relief for tourists.
But what about Nauru? I've heard it's one of the most linguistically diverse countries in the world, with over 20 languages spoken.
That's amazing. And speaking of languages, did you know that Dongguk is a member of the Sino-Tibetan language family? It's a beautiful language with a unique script.
Ah, yes. I've seen the script before. It's like a mix of Chinese and Tibetan characters. But tell me, how common is it for tourists to communicate in English in Bhutan?
Well, it's actually quite common, especially in tourist areas like Bimphenporo. But I've heard that in more rural areas, locals might not speak much English. It's always a good idea to learn a few basic Dongguk phrases.
That's a great tip. And what about Nauru? Do locals speak English there?
Yes. English is the official language of Nauru. But many locals also speak Nauruan, which is a Polynesian language. It's a beautiful language, but I've heard it's quite challenging to learn.
I can imagine. I've tried to learn a few Polynesian languages before, and it's not easy. But I've heard that Norwegians are very friendly and welcoming to tourists.
That's true. I've heard that Norwegians are known for their hospitality and warm welcomes. And I'm sure our listeners living in Nauru would agree with me.
I'm sure they would. But tell me, Mia, what's it like to communicate with locals in Nauru? Do you need to learn any specific phrases or gestures?
Yes. It's actually quite easy to communicate with locals in Nauru. Many of them speak English. And even if they don't, they're often very willing to help tourists with gestures and body language.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the language and culture of Nauru. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
I'm sure they will. But I think what's most interesting about Nauru is its unique cultural heritage. The Nauruan culture is a blend of Polynesian and Micronesian influences, which is reflected in their language, customs, and traditions.
Ah, that's fascinating. I've heard that Nauru has a rich cultural heritage, and I'd love to learn more about it. Can you tell me more about the Nauruan language and its significance in Nauruan culture?
Yes. The Nauruan language is a beautiful language that reflects the cultural identity of the Nauruan people. It's a Polynesian language that's spoken by only a few thousand people. Thus, it's an important part of Nauruan culture and heritage.
I see. And what about Bhutan? How does the Dongok language reflect the culture and heritage of the Bhutanese people?
The Dongok language is a beautiful language that's deeply connected to the culture and heritage of the Bhutanese people. It's a Sino-Tibetan language that's spoken by only a few 100,000 people. But it's an important part of Bhutanese culture and identity.
I see. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the language and culture of Bhutan. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know in the comments section below.
I'm sure they will. But I think what's most interesting about Bhutan is its unique cultural heritage. The Bhutanese culture is a blend of Buddhist and Tibetan influences, which is reflected in their language, customs, and traditions.
That's fascinating. I've heard that Bhutan has a rich cultural heritage, and I'd love to learn more about it. Can you tell me more about the Dongok language and its significance in Bhutanese culture?
Yes. The Dongok language is a beautiful language that reflects the cultural identity of the Bhutanese people. It's a Sino-Tibetan language that's spoken by only a few 100,000 people. But it's an important part of Bhutanese culture and heritage.
I see. And what about Nauru? How does the Nauruan language reflect the culture and heritage of the Nauruan people?
The Nauruan language is a beautiful language that reflects the cultural identity of the Nauruan people. It's a Polynesian language that's spoken by only a few thousand people, but it's an important part of Nauruan culture and heritage.
I see. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the language and culture of Nauru. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
I'm sure they will. But I think what's most interesting about Nauru is its unique cultural heritage. The Nauruan culture is a blend of Polynesian and Micronesian influences, which is reflected in their language, customs, and traditions.
That's fascinating. I've heard that Nauru has a rich cultural heritage, and I'd love to learn more about it. Can you tell me more about the Nauruan language and its significance in Nauruan culture?
Yes. The Nauruan language is a beautiful language that's deeply connected to the culture and heritage of the Nauruan people. It's a Polynesian language that's spoken by only a few thousand people, but it's an important part of Nauruan culture and identity.
I see. And what about Bhutan? How does the Dongok language reflect the culture and heritage of the Bhutanese people?
The Dongok language is a beautiful language that's deeply connected to the culture and heritage of the Bhutanese people. It's a Sino-Tibetan language that's spoken by only a few 100,000 people, but it's an important part of Bhutanese culture and identity.
I see. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the language and culture of Bhutan. If you have any questions or comments, Please let us know in the comments section below.
I'm sure. But I think what's most interesting about Bhutan is its unique cultural heritage. The Bhutanese culture is a blend of Buddhist and Tibetan influences, which is tied into the fascinating world of cultural diversity and tolerance in Bhutan and Nauru. I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the most striking aspect of Bhutan's approach to cultural diversity?
Mira, I think Bhutan's emphasis on gross national happiness is a unique approach to measuring cultural diversity. It's not just about economic growth, but also about the well-being of its citizens. And that's something that Nauru, on the other hand, could learn from.
That's a great point, Leo. And speaking of Nauru, I've heard that it has one of the most homogeneous populations in the world. What do you think is the challenge of having such a small and homogeneous population when it comes to cultural diversity?
Well, Mira, I think it's actually a double-edged sword. On the one hand, having a small population can make it easier to maintain social cohesion and cultural unity. But on the other hand, it can also make it more challenging to introduce new ideas and perspectives, which is essential for cultural diversity.
I see what you mean, Leo. And in Bhutan, I've noticed that they have a strong tradition of tolerating different cultures and religions. In fact, they even have a law that prohibits the promotion of any religion other than Buddhism. What do you think about that?
Mira. I think that's a great example of how Bhutan is committed to promoting cultural tolerance and diversity. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do they think that promoting a particular religion can be a form of cultural intolerance?
That's a great question, Leo. And speaking of cultural intolerance, I've heard that Nauru has faced some challenges in terms of racism and xenophobia. What do you think is the root cause of these issues? And how can they be addressed?
Well, Mira, I think that racism and xenophobia are often the result of a lack of understanding and exposure to different cultures. And in Nauru's case, it's likely due to its small and isolated population. But I think that with education and awareness, these issues can be addressed and cultural diversity can be promoted.
I completely agree. Leo. And in Bhutan, I've noticed that they have a strong tradition of respecting and tolerating different cultures and religions. In fact, they even have a saying that the root of all happiness is compassion. What do you think about that?
Mira, I think that's a beautiful saying, and it really reflects the values of Bhutanese culture. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do they think that compassion and tolerance are essential for promoting cultural diversity and tolerance?
That's a great question, Leo. And speaking of compassion and tolerance, I've heard that Bhutan has a unique approach to dealing with social conflicts. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, Mira, I think that Bhutan's approach to conflict resolution is centered around compassion and empathy. They believe that conflicts can be resolved through dialogue and understanding, rather than through violence and aggression. And I think that's something that Nauru could learn from.
I see what you mean, Leo. And in Nauru, I've noticed that they have a strong tradition of community-based development. What do you think is the benefit of this approach? And how can it be applied to promote cultural diversity and tolerance?
Mira, I think that community-based development is an excellent way to promote cultural diversity and tolerance. By empowering local communities to take charge of their own development, they can make decisions that are tailored to their specific needs and cultural context. And I think that's something that Bhutan could learn from.
I completely agree. And in Bhutan, I've noticed that they have a strong tradition of promoting cultural diversity through music and dance. What do you think about that?
Mira, I think that's a great example of how Bhutan is promoting cultural diversity through the arts. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do they think that music and dance are effective ways to promote cultural diversity and tolerance?
That's a great question, Leo. And speaking of music and dance, I've heard that Nauru has a unique traditional dance called the Nauru Traditional Dance. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, Mira, I think that the Nauru traditional dance is a great example of the country's rich cultural heritage. and I think that it's something that Bhutan could learn from, in terms of promoting cultural diversity and tolerance through the arts.
I see what you mean, Leo. And in Bhutan, I've noticed that they have a strong tradition of promoting cultural diversity through education. What do you think about that?
Oh, Mira, I think that's a great example of how Bhutan is promoting cultural diversity through education. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do they think that education is an effective way to promote cultural diversity and tolerance?
That's a great question, Leo. And speaking of education, I've heard that Nauru has a unique approach to education that emphasizes traditional knowledge and skills. What do you think about that?
Well, Mira, I think that Nauru's approach to education is a great example of how the country is promoting cultural diversity and tolerance. By emphasizing traditional knowledge and skills, they are preserving their cultural heritage and promoting cultural diversity.
I completely agree. And in Bhutan, I've noticed that they have a strong tradition of promoting cultural diversity through community-based tourism. What do you think about that?
Mira, I think that's a great example of how Bhutan is promoting cultural diversity through tourism. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do they think that community-based tourism is an effective way to promote cultural diversity and tolerance?
That's a great question, Leo. And speaking of community-based tourism, I've heard that Nauru has a unique approach to tourism that emphasizes cultural exchange and understanding. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, Mira, I think that Nauru's approach to tourism is a great example of how the country is promoting cultural diversity and tolerance. By emphasizing cultural exchange and understanding, they are promoting cross-cultural understanding and tolerance.
I completely agree, Leo. And in Bhutan, I've noticed that they have a strong tradition of promoting cultural diversity through art and crafts. What do you think about that?
Mira, I think that's a great example of how Bhutan is promoting cultural diversity through the arts. And I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do they think that art and crafts are effective ways to promote cultural diversity and tolerance?
That's a great question, Leo. And speaking of art and crafts, I've heard that Nauru has. So, let's dive into the educational opportunities and language schools in Bhutan and Nauru. I've always been fascinated by Bhutan's focus on gross national happiness, which includes education as a key factor. Did you know that Bhutan has a unique approach to education? Neo?
Yes. I've heard of it. They have a curriculum that emphasizes the development of the whole person, not just the mind. It's all about creating compassionate and wise citizens. But I'm curious, Mira, how does Bhutan's education system compare to Nauru's?
Well, Nauru's education system is actually quite different. It's a small country with limited resources, but they've made significant strides in improving literacy rates. I'm sure our listeners living in Nauru would agree that education is a top priority.
That's true. And I've heard that Nauru has a strong focus on vocational training, preparing students for the workforce. But I'm curious, Mira, what about language acquisition? How do students in Bhutan and Nauru learn English and other languages?
Great question, Leo. In Bhutan, English is the primary language of instruction, but students also learn Dongok, the national language. It's a beautiful language with a unique script. And in Nauru, students learn English as a second language, but they also have the opportunity to learn other Pacific languages like Nauruan.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I've heard that Bhutan has a unique approach to language acquisition, using a combination of traditional and modern methods. But I'm curious, Mira, what about student testimonials? What do students in Bhutan and Nauru say about their educational experiences?
That's a great question, Leo. I've spoken to several students from Bhutan, and they rave about the emphasis on compassion and wisdom in their education. And in Nauru, students have told me that they appreciate the focus on vocational training, which prepares them for the workforce.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the educational opportunities in both countries. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. But I'm curious. Mira, what about the role of technology in education? How are Bhutan and Nauru using technology to improve learning outcomes?
Great question. Leo, in Bhutan, technology is being used to support language acquisition with online resources and language learning apps. And in Nauru, technology is being used to enhance vocational training with online courses and simulations.
Wow, that's amazing. And I've heard that Bhutan has a unique approach to teacher training, using a combination of traditional and modern methods. But I'm curious. Mira, what about the challenges facing education in both countries? What are the biggest hurdles that educators and policymakers are facing?
Oh, that's a great question. Leo, in Bhutan, the biggest challenge is actually the need for more resources, including textbooks and technology. And in Nauru, the biggest challenge is the limited availability of educational resources, including qualified teachers.
That's a challenge that many countries face. But I'm curious. Mira, what about the potential for education to drive economic development in both countries? How can education help Bhutan and Nauru achieve their economic goals?
Oh, that's a great question. Leo, in Bhutan, education is seen as a key driver of economic development, with a focus on creating skilled and knowledgeable citizens. And in Nauru, education is also seen as a key driver of economic development, with a focus on preparing students for the workforce.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the educational opportunities in both countries. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. But I'm curious. Mira, what about the cultural significance of education in both countries? How does education reflect the values and traditions of Bhutan and Nauru?
Oh, that's a great question. Leo, in Bhutan, education is deeply rooted in the country's Buddhist heritage, with a focus on compassion and wisdom. And in Nauru, education reflects the country's Pacific Islander heritage, with a focus on community and cultural preservation.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I've heard that Bhutan has a unique approach to language preservation, using a combination of traditional and modern methods. But I'm curious. Mira, what about the future of education in both countries? What are the biggest trends and innovations that we can expect to see in the years to come?
That's a great question. Leo, in Bhutan, the biggest trend is actually the increasing use of technology to support language acquisition and vocational training. And in Nauru, the biggest trend is the growing emphasis on vocational training and career development.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the educational opportunities in both countries. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. But I'm curious. Mira, what about the role of international cooperation in education? How can countries like Bhutan and Nauru benefit from international collaboration and partnerships?
That's a great question. In Bhutan, international cooperation is playing a key role in supporting education, with partnerships with countries like India and Australia. And in Nauru, international cooperation is also playing a key role, with partnerships with countries like New Zealand and Japan.
Wow, that's amazing. And I've heard that Bhutan has a unique approach to language preservation, using a combination of traditional and modern methods. But I'm curious. Mira, what about the impact of education on the environment and sustainability? How can education help Bhutan and Nauru address their environmental challenges?
That's a great question. Leo, in Bhutan, education is playing a key role in promoting environmental sustainability, with a focus on conservation and preservation. And in Nauru, education is also playing a key role, with a focus on sustainable development and resource management.
That's great to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the educational opportunities in both countries. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments. But I'm curious. Mira, what about the role of education in promoting cultural heritage and preservation? How can education help Bhutan and Nauru preserve their cultural traditions?
Ah, that's a great question. In Bhutan, education is playing a key role in preserving the country's cultural heritage, with a focus on language and cultural preservation. And in Nauru, education is also playing a key role, with a focus on cultural preservation and community development.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I've heard that Bhutan has a unique approach to language preservation, using a combination of.
And so to dive into the climate and seasonal conditions of our two countries, let's start with Bhutan, a country nestled in the Himalayas. Can you believe it's one of the least visited countries in the world? Yet it's also one of the most pristine and untouched.
Ah, Bhutan. A true gem. The Himalayas provide a dramatic backdrop to its unique climate. We're talking about a country where the temperature can drop to 20 degrees Celsius in winter and dries to 30 degrees Celsius in summer. Talk about a climate roller coaster.
That's exactly what I was. And did you know that Bhutan's climate is also influenced by its unique geography? The country's mountains create a rain shadow effect, resulting in a dry and sunny climate in the western parts of the country, while the eastern parts receive heavy rainfall.
That's fascinating. And it's not just the climate that's unique. The culture is also deeply connected to the environment. The Bhutanese people have a profound respect for nature, which is reflected in their sustainable tourism practices and commitment to preserving their natural heritage.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, Leo, have you ever experienced the unique phenomenon of the Bhutanese sun? It's when the sun shines brightly in the morning, but by the afternoon, the clouds roll in, and it's suddenly overcast.
Ah, yes. I have. It's like the sun is playing hide and seek with the clouds. But, seriously, the Bhutanese sun is a reminder of the country's unique climate and the importance of respecting nature's moods.
Well said. Leo, now, let's move on to Nauru, a small island nation in the Pacific Ocean. Can you tell us a bit about its climate?
Ah, Nauru, a country that's truly off the beaten path. Nauru's climate is tropical, with high temperatures and high humidity year-round. But what's unique about Nauru is its lack of seasons. It's one of the few countries in the world that experiences a relatively constant temperature throughout the year.
Well, that's incredible. And did you know that Nauru is also one of the countries most vulnerable to climate change? Rising sea levels and increased storm intensity are major concerns for the island nation.
Yes, it's a challenging situation, but the people of Nauru are resilient and resourceful. They're working hard to adapt to the changing climate and protect their island home.
I'm sure our listeners would agree that climate change is a pressing issue that requires our attention and action. If you are living in Nauru or have experienced similar climate-related challenges, please share your thoughts and stories in the comments section below.
Absolutely. And let's not forget to mention the unique cultural practices of the Nauruan people. Their traditional dances and music are an integral part of their identity and a reflection of their deep connection to the land and sea.
Oh, yes. And I'm curious. Leo, have you ever experienced the Nauru and tradition kava ceremonies? It's a unique cultural practice that brings people together to share stories and strengthen social bonds.
Ah, yes, I have. And it's an incredible experience, watching the Nauruan people come together to share laughter, stories, and kava.
Well, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about Nauru's unique cultural practices. If you have any stories or experiences to share, please let us know in the comments below.
And finally, let's talk about the importance of preserving our natural heritage. Both Bhutan and Nauru have made significant strides in protecting their environment and promoting sustainable tourism practices. It's a reminder that we can all make a difference by respecting and preserving our natural world.
Well said, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that climate change is a pressing issue that requires our attention and action. Let's all do our part to reduce our carbon footprint and promote sustainable practices.
Absolutely. And before we wrap up, let's take a moment to appreciate the unique climate and seasonal conditions of our two countries. From the Himalayas to the Pacific Ocean, each country has its own unique story to tell.
And that's a wrap. Folks, Thanks for joining us on this journey through the climate and seasonal conditions of Bhutan and Nauru. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to stay up to date on our latest episodes. And if you have any thoughts or stories to share, please leave them in the comments below. I'm set to dive into the food, culture, and nutritional alternatives of Bhutan and Nauru. Both countries have unique culinary traditions that reflect their geographical and cultural contexts.
That's right. Nia, Bhutan's cuisine is heavily influenced by its Tibetan and Nepali heritage, with a focus on red rice, chilies, and spices. Nauru, on the other hand, has a more limited culinary landscape due to its small size and remote location.
But that doesn't mean Nauru doesn't have its own charm. I've heard that Nauruans love to eat traditional dishes like coconut crab and breadfruit. And Bhutan has its own version of a national dish, I'm mad at say, which is a spicy cheese stew.
Yes. I'm mad at say is a favorite among the locals. But I've also heard that Nauruans are quite fond of Western-style cuisine, especially after World War I, when the country became a British colony.
That's fascinating. It's interesting to see how different cultural influences shape the food culture of a country. But let's talk about nutrition. Both Bhutan and Nauru have unique challenges when it comes to providing healthy food options to their citizens.
Absolutely. Bhutan has a high prevalence of malnutrition, particularly among children. And Nauru has one of the highest rates of obesity in the world. It's a complex issue, but I think it's great that both countries are working to address these challenges through education and community-based initiatives.
I completely agree. And it's not just about providing healthy food options, but also about promoting sustainable agriculture and reducing food waste. Bhutan has made significant strides in this area, with its Bhutan for Life initiative aimed at promoting organic farming and reducing plastic use.
Wow, that's impressive. And Nauru has its own initiatives, like the Nauru Food Security Project aimed at improving food security and reducing reliance on imported food.
And I think it's great that both countries are prioritizing food security and sustainability. But let's talk about some of the unique food traditions in Bhutan. What do you know about the country's love of tea?
Yes. Tea is a staple in Bhutanese culture. They have a unique tea ceremony called the Chakai ceremony, where tea is served as a sign of respect and friendship.
That's beautiful. And I've heard that Nauru has its own unique tea traditions as well. Can you tell us more about that?
Actually, Nauruans don't really have a strong tea culture, but they do love to drink coffee, especially after World War I, when the country became a British colony.
I see. Well, it's interesting to see how different cultural influences shape the food culture of a country. But let's talk about some of the unique ingredients used in Bhutanese cuisine. What do you know about the country's love of chilies?
Yes. Chilies are a staple in Bhutanese cuisine. They're used to add flavor and heat to a variety of dishes, including the national dish, I'm mad at say.
That's right. And I've heard that Nauruans also love to use chilies in their cooking. But they also use a lot of coconut milk and breadfruit.
Yes. Coconut milk and breadfruit are staples in Nauruan cuisine. And I've heard that the country's love of coconut milk is due to its high calorie content, which helps to combat malnutrition.
That's interesting. Well, it's clear that both Bhutan and Nauru have unique food cultures that reflect their geographical and cultural contexts. And it's great to see how both countries are working to address the challenges of food security and sustainability.
Absolutely. And I think it's great that our listeners can learn more about these two countries and their unique food cultures. If you're interested in learning more, be sure to check out our links in the description below.
And if you have any questions or comments, please let us know in the comment section. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Until next time, when we'll be discussing another exciting topic. Farewell for now.
Wait. What? No farewell. We're just getting started. Bhutan, the land of the Thunder Dragon, is renowned for its pristine environment, stunning landscapes, and vibrant culture. I'm fascinated by the country's unique approach to development, which prioritizes gross national happiness over economic growth.
That's really interesting. I've heard that Bhutan has a strict policy of maintaining its natural environment and not allowing mass tourism to disrupt its ecosystems.
Exactly. The government has implemented a high-value, low-impact tourism policy, which ensures that visitors have a high-quality experience while minimizing their impact on the environment.
Ah, I see what you mean. It's like they're saying, we want to preserve our natural beauty, so we'll limit the number of visitors to keep it pristine.
Yes, and that's not all. Bhutan also has a rich cultural heritage, with a unique blend of Buddhism and traditional festivals that are steeped in history and significance.
I've heard that the country's architecture is also incredibly unique, with a mix of Buddhist and Tibetan influences.
That's right. The Dzong architecture, for example, is a blend of Buddhist and Tibetan styles, with intricately carved wooden beams and ornate decorations.
Wow, I'd love to see that in person. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that Bhutan's cultural heritage is something to be preserved and respected.
Absolutely. And speaking of cultural heritage, jet off. AI loves uncovering stories like this, and so do we. It's amazing to see how Bhutan's unique approach to development has allowed it to maintain its natural beauty and cultural significance.
That's so true. And I think it's also worth noting that Bhutan has a very strong sense of national identity, with a clear vision for its future that is centered around preserving its culture and environment.
Exactly. And that's something that our listeners can definitely relate to, especially those who are passionate about environmentalism and cultural preservation.
Ah, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that Bhutan's approach to development is something that other countries can learn from?
Well, I think it's definitely worth considering. After all, as we always say, a happy nation is a healthy nation.
That's a great point. Mira, and speaking of happy nations, let's talk about Nauru, the world's smallest island nation.
Nauru. I've heard that it's fascinating history, with a unique cultural heritage that is shaped by its specific islander roots.
That's right. Nauru has a rich cultural heritage, with a strong sense of community and tradition that is deeply rooted in its Pacific Islander identity.
I've also heard that Nauru has a stunning natural beauty, with coral reefs, white sand beaches, and a vibrant marine ecosystem.
Yes, and it's also worth noting that Nauru has a unique cultural tradition of storytelling and oral history, with a strong emphasis on preserving its history and cultural heritage.
That's so cool. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about Nauru's cultural heritage and the ways in which it is preserved and passed down to future generations.
I think we can definitely explore that further. And speaking of preserving cultural heritage, Jenov, I has an amazing platform for sharing and discovering cultural stories and traditions.
That's right. And I'm sure our listeners would love to check it out and learn more about Nauru's cultural heritage and the ways in which it is preserved and passed down to future generations.
Well, I think that's all for now. But before we go, I want to ask our listeners, what do you think about Bhutan and Nauru's unique approaches to development and cultural preservation?
Great question, Leo. And I think our listeners would love to share their thoughts and opinions on this topic. So, let's hear from you in the comments.
Well, there you have it. Folks, Bhutan and Nauru, two countries that are leading the way in cultural preservation and environmental sustainability.
I'm to dive into the natural beauties and landscapes of Bhutan and Nauru. Two countries that are often overlooked but offer some of the most breathtaking scenery on the planet. I mean, who wouldn't want to explore the Himalayas or discover the secrets of a tiny island nation?
Yes, and both countries have their own unique charm. Bhutan, with its rugged terrain and lush forests, is a nature lover's paradise. And Nauru, with its crystal clear waters and coral reefs, is a snorkeler's dream come true.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. The diversity of landscapes in these two countries is just incredible. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever been to Bhutan? What was your impression of the country's natural beauty?
Well, I've been to Bhutan a few times, and I must say, it's a truly unforgettable experience. The Himalayas are breathtaking, and the culture is so rich and vibrant. But, I have to say, the most memorable part of my trip was the trek to the Tiger's Nest Monastery. It was an incredible hike, and the views from the top were simply stunning.
Well, that sounds amazing. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have any of you been to Bhutan and or Nauru? What were your favorite experiences?
Ah, yes. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that Nauru's natural beauty is just as impressive as Bhutan's. The island nation has a unique landscape that's shaped by its volcanic history. And, oh, of course, the coral reefs are a snorkeler's paradise.
That's right. And speaking of coral reefs, I've heard that Nauru has some of the most pristine coral reefs in the Pacific. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that. Leo, can you tell us more about Nauru's coral reefs?
Ah, yes. The coral reefs in Nauru are indeed some of the most pristine in the Pacific. And, what's more, they're home to an incredible array of marine life, from sea turtles to manta rays. The reefs are teeming with wildlife.
That's incredible. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the best spots to snorkel or dive in Nauru. Have you got any recommendations? Leo?
Ah, yes. There are several great spots to snorkel or dive in Nauru. One of the most popular spots is the Beauties Lagoon, which is home to a stunning array of marine life. And, of course, there's also the coral reefs off the coast of Bar, which are simply breathtaking.
Well, that sounds amazing. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have any of you snorkeled or dived in Nauru? What were your experiences like?
Ah, yes. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that Bhutan's natural beauty is just as impressive as Nauru's. The country has a unique landscape that's shaped by its Himalayan history. And, of course, the forests are home to an incredible array of wildlife.
That's right. And speaking of forests, I've heard that Bhutan has some of the most pristine forests in the world. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that. Leo, can you tell us more about Bhutan's forests?
Ah, yes. The forests in Bhutan are indeed some of the most pristine in the world. And what's more, they're home to an incredible array of wildlife, including the majestic snow leopard.
That's incredible. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the best spots to hike or trek in Bhutan. Have you got any recommendations? Leo?
Ah, yes. There are several great spots to hike or trek in Bhutan. One of the most popular spots is the trek to the Tiger's Nest Monastery, which I mentioned earlier. And, of course, there's also the hike to the top of the Himalayas, which is simply breathtaking.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have any of you hiked or trekked in Bhutan or Nauru? What were your experiences like?
Ah, yes. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that both Bhutan and Nauru offer some of the most unique and breathtaking natural landscapes in the world. Whether it's the Himalayas or the coral reefs, there's no shortage of natural beauty to explore in these two countries.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. The natural beauty of Bhutan and Nauru is truly unforgettable. As we always say, if you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
Ah, yes. And I'm sure our listeners will have plenty to say about this topic. So let's keep the conversation going and see what our listeners think about the natural beauties and landscapes of Bhutan and Nauru.
I'm thrilled to dive into the world of sports, activity, and adventure options in Bhutan and Nauru. Who would have thought that these two countries would offer such unique experiences?
Oh, I think it's because they're both off the beaten path, right? I mean, Bhutan's got its stunning Himalayan landscapes, and Nauru's got its tiny island vibes.
Exactly. And let's start with Bhutan's national sport, archery. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried archery?
No, I'm more of a hit a target from a distance with a laser kind of guy. But I've heard archery in Bhutan is more about the art of it than just hitting the target.
That's so true. And speaking of art, Have you seen the traditional Bhutan archery competitions? It's like a fusion of sport and dance.
I can imagine. I'd love to see it. And what about Nauru? What kind of adventure options do they offer?
Well, Nauru's got its own unique take on adventure sports. For instance, have you heard about the Nauru surf competition?
Surf competition? Isn't Nauru in Thailand?
Ah, yes, it is. But the Nauru surf competition is more like a wave-making competition.
I see what you did there. That's hilarious. But seriously, I'm curious about the surfing scene in Nauru. How does it work?
Well, the competition involves creating artificial waves on the island's beach. It's a bit unconventional, but it's definitely a unique experience.
Wow, I'd love to see that. And what about the infrastructure for sports and adventure in Bhutan? How does it compare to Nauru?
Bhutan's got a well-developed infrastructure for sports and adventure. They've got everything from trekking to mountaineering to, archery. Of course.
Of course. And what about Nauru? How does it compare?
Well, Nauru's got a more limited infrastructure, but it's still a great place for adventure seekers. They've got snorkeling, diving, and, surfing. Of course.
I'm starting to think that surfing is a national pastime in Nauru.
Well, maybe it's not a national pastime, but definitely a unique aspect of the island's culture.
I'm curious. Mira, what do you think is the biggest challenge for adventure seekers in Nauru?
I think it's the lack of infrastructure and resources. But that's also what makes it so appealing, right? The raw, untamed beauty of the island.
That's true. And what about Bhutan? What's the biggest challenge for adventure seekers there?
I think it's the high altitude and rugged terrain. But that's also what makes it so rewarding, right? The sense of accomplishment and connection with nature.
I see what you mean. And speaking of connection with nature, have you heard about the ecotourism initiatives in Bhutan?
Yes. Bhutan's got a strong focus on sustainable tourism and preserving its natural environment. It's a great model for other countries to follow.
That's terrific. And what about Nauru? Do they have any ecotourism initiative?
Actually, yes. Nauru's got a program to protect its marine environment and promote sustainable fishing practices.
Wow, I didn't know that. It's great to see both countries taking steps to protect their environment.
Exactly. And that's what makes this podcast so great. We get to explore all these unique aspects of different countries and cultures.
And I get to make fun of surfing in Nauru.
Oh, Leo, you're such a goofball.
Hey, someone's got to keep things light around here.
You know, Leo, have you ever tried to find nightlife in Bhutan? It's like searching for a needle in a haystack.
Yeah, I have. And let me tell you, it's more like searching for a party in a monastery. But seriously, Bhutan has a very unique approach to nightlife. They focus on cultural events and festivals, which are usually free and open to the public.
That's so cool. And I'm sure our listeners living in Bhutan would agree with me that these events are a great way to experience the local culture. But, Leo, I have to ask, have you ever been to one of these festivals? What was it like?
Oh, yeah. I went to the Punakya Festival, and it was an incredible experience. The music, the dancing, the food was all so vibrant and colorful. And the best part was, I got to try some traditional Bhutanese drinks, like aran suya.
Aran suya. Huh? I'm not sure if I'd be brave enough to try those. But I'm sure our listeners are curious about what these drinks taste like. Leo, can you tell us more about them?
Well, let's just say they're an acquired taste. Ara is made from fermented rice and is usually served as a shot. Suya is a traditional Bhutanese tea that's made from the leaves of the suya plant. It's got a unique flavor that's a bit bitter, but it's supposed to have medicinal properties.
That sounds interesting. I'm sure our listeners would love to try these drinks, but maybe not in the same way as you did. Moving on to Nauru. I've heard that it's one of the most difficult places to find nightlife. What's the situation like there? Leo?
Yeah, Nauru is definitely not known for its nightlife. In fact, it's one of the smallest countries in the world, and it's got a very laid-back atmosphere. But if you're looking for some entertainment, there are a few bars and restaurants that offer live music and dancing.
That sounds like a great way to experience the local culture. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about Nauru's unique nightlife scene. Leo, can you tell us more about the bars and restaurants you mentioned?
Well, there's a few places in Warren, the capital city, that offer live music and dancing. And if you're lucky, you might even catch a traditional Nauru and dance performance. But let's be real, nightlife in Nauru is not exactly what you'd call lively.
Fair enough. I'm sure our listeners would agree that Nauru's nightlife is a bit tame. But I'm curious. Leo, have you ever been to Nauru? What was your experience like?
Yeah, I went to Nauru a few years ago, and it was a really unique experience. The people are so friendly and welcoming, and the scenery is just breathtaking. But let's just say that nightlife is not exactly the highlight of the island.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about Nauru's unique culture and scenery. And I'm sure they'd agree with me that Bhutan's festivals and events are a great way to experience the local culture. But, Leo, I have to ask, have you ever been to any of Nauru's festivals or events?
Actually, yeah, I went to the Nauru and Independence Day celebrations, and it was a really cool experience. The music, the dancing, the food, it was all so vibrant and colorful. And the best part was, I got to try some traditional Nauruan cuisine, like Bill Amantinake.
Bill, Amantinake. Huh? I'm not sure if I'd be brave enough to try those. But I'm sure our listeners are curious about what these dishes taste like. Leah, can you tell us more about them?
Well, let's just say they're an acquired taste. Belam is a traditional Nauruan dish made from fermented fish, and tinake is a type of Norwegian flatbread. They're both supposed to have medicinal properties, but I'm not sure if I'd recommend them to anyone.
Well, there you have it. Folks, 2 countries, 2 unique nightlife scenes. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about these countries and their cultures. And I'm sure they'd agree with me that Bhutan's festivals and events are a great way to experience the local culture. But, Leah, I have to ask, what's your favorite way to experience nightlife?
Well, I'm a bit of a party animal, so I love going to clubs and bars and just letting loose. But I also love experiencing the local culture and trying new things, like traditional drinks and foods.
That's so cool. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about Leo's nightlife adventures. And I'm sure they'd agree with me that Nauru's unique culture and scenery are definitely worth experiencing. But, Leo, I have to ask, what's the most memorable nightlife experience you've had?
Oh, that's a tough one. But I think it would have to be the time I went to a traditional Bhutanese festival and got to try some of the local drinks and foods. It was just such a unique and immersive experience, and I loved every minute of it.
Well, there you have it. Folks, 2 countries, 2 unique nightlife scenes. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about these countries and their cultures. And I'm sure they'd agree with me that Bhutan's festivals and events are a great way to experience the local culture. But, Leo, I have to ask, what's next for us? Are we going to explore more of Nauru's nightlife scene?
Actually, yeah. I wish we could check out some of the local bars and restaurants and see what they have to offer. Who knows? Maybe we'll even find a few party animals to join us.
Sounds like a plan to me. Leo, let's go and see what Nauru's nightlife has to offer. And who knows, maybe we'll even find some new favorite drinks and foods to try. I'm so to dive into the world of family-friendly environments and children's activities in Bhutan and Nauru. Both countries have their unique way of nurturing kids and strengthening family life. Let's start with Bhutan.
Ah, Bhutan, the land of the happy people. I've heard their concept of gross national happiness is all about creating a society that values family and community. But what does that look like in practice?
Well, Leo, Bhutan has a lot to offer when it comes to family-friendly activities. They have beautiful parks and gardens, like the Janganke Halhakon Temple, which is a great place for kids to learn about Buddhism and culture.
That's fascinating. But what about Nauru? I've heard it's a bit more isolated. How do they manage to create a family-friendly environment in a country with such a small population?
Good question. Leo, Nauru might be small, but it has a strong focus on community and family. They have a lot of cultural events and festivals that are perfect for families to enjoy together.
I see. So, it's not just about the size of the country, but about the values and priorities of the people. That's really interesting. I'm sure our listeners living in Nauru would agree with me.
Absolutely. Leo, and speaking of values, Bhutan's emphasis on gross national happiness has actually led to some amazing initiatives for children's education and development. They have programs like the Bhutan Youth Development Fund, which supports youth-led projects and initiatives.
Wow, that's impressive. But what about Nauru? Do they have similar programs or initiatives for children's education and development?
Yes. Nauru has its own way of supporting children's education and development. They have programs like the Nauru Education Department, which works to improve education standards and provide opportunities for children to learn and grow.
I'm curious. Mira, how do the two countries compare when it comes to family-friendly activities? Are there any specific activities or attractions that stand out in each country?
Well, Leo, Bhutan has some amazing festivals and events that are perfect for families to enjoy together, like the Thimphati Shichu Festival, which is a traditional mass dance festival that's a lot of fun for kids.
That sounds amazing. And what about Nauru? Do they have similar festivals or events that are great for families?
Yes. Nauru has its own unique festivals and events, like the Nauru Independence Day celebrations, which are a great way for families to come together and celebrate their country's independence.
I see. So, it's not just about the size of the country or the number of festivals and events, but about the sense of community and family that's present in both Bhutan and Nauru.
Exactly. Leo, and speaking of community, I'm curious, what do you think our listeners would say is the most important aspect of family-friendly environments and children's activities in these two countries?
That's a great question. Mira, I think our listeners would say that it's the sense of community and family that's present in both countries, whether it's through festivals, events, or programs for children's education and development. Both Bhutan and Nauru prioritize the well-being and happiness of their citizens.
I completely agree. Leo, and I think that's what makes both countries so unique and special when it comes to family-friendly environments and children's activities.
Well, there you have it. Folks, Bhutan and Nauru might be two very different countries, but they share a common thread when it comes to family-friendly environments and children's activities.
And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that it's the sense of community and family that truly makes a country great. If we're talking about LGBT-friendly atmospheres, Bhutan and Nauru are quite an interesting pair. Bhutan, with its Buddhist culture, has a reputation for being open-minded, but Nauru, being one of the smallest countries in the world, might have a different story to tell.
That's a great point, Mira. Bhutan's government has officially endorsed the LGBT community, and the country has made significant progress in promoting inclusivity. But Nauru, on the other hand, has a more conservative approach, with limited resources and a small population.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the main reason behind Bhutan's progressive stance on LGBT rights? Is it the Buddhist influence or something else entirely?
Well, Mira, I think it's a combination of factors. Bhutan's government has been actively promoting tourism, and they've realized that being open-minded and inclusive is key to attracting visitors. Plus, the Buddhist tradition emphasizes compassion and acceptance, which has helped to create a more welcoming environment for the LGBT community.
That makes sense. And what about Nauru? Leo? What can we say about its approach to LGBT rights?
Nauru has a more restrictive approach, to say the least. The country has a small population, and the government has been criticized for its human rights record. However, it's worth noting that Nauru has a growing expat community, and some of these expats have been working to promote LGBT rights and awareness.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. If you're from Nauru or have experience with the LGBT community there, please share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspectives.
Absolutely. Mira. And I think it's worth mentioning that both Bhutan and Nauru have a long way to go in terms of promoting LGBT rights. However, Bhutan's progress is certainly a step in the right direction.
Exactly. Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that Nauru's small size can actually be an advantage when it comes to promoting inclusivity. With a smaller population, it's easier to create a sense of community and promote acceptance.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have a rich cultural heritage that can be leveraged to promote LGBT rights. For example, in Bhutan, the Buddhist tradition can be used to promote compassion and acceptance, while in Nauru, the country's Pacific Islander culture can be used to promote a sense of community and inclusivity.
I love that idea, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that our listeners can play a role in promoting LGBT rights in both countries by sharing their experiences and perspectives. They can help to create a more inclusive environment for everyone.
Absolutely, Mia. And I think it's worth mentioning that both Bhutan and Nauru have a lot to offer in terms of tourism. Whether you're interested in Bhutan's stunning natural beauty or Nauru's unique culture, there's something for everyone.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that our listeners can help to promote LGBT tourism in both countries. By supporting LGBT-friendly businesses and promoting inclusive tourism, they can help to create a more welcoming environment for everyone.
Well, Mira, I think that's all the time we have for today. But before we go, I just want to say that it's been great chatting with you about LGBT-friendly atmospheres in Bhutan and Nauru.
Thanks, Leah. And I think it's worth mentioning that our listeners can continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts and perspectives in the comments. We'd love to hear from you and learn more about your experiences.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's worth mentioning that our listeners can also follow us on social media to stay up to date on the latest news and developments in LGBT rights around the world.
That's a great idea, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that our listeners can help to promote LGBT rights by sharing their stories and experiences. Whether it's through social media or in person, every voice matters.
Well, Mira, I think that before we go, I just want to say that it's been great chatting with you about LGBT-friendly atmospheres in Bhutan and Nauru.
Thanks, Leo. And I think it's worth mentioning that our listeners can continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts and perspectives in the comments. We'd love to hear from you and learn more about your experiences.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's worth mentioning that our listeners can also follow us on social media to stay up to date on the latest news and developments in LGBT rights around the world.
That's a great idea, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that our listeners can help to promote LGBT rights by sharing their stories and experiences. Whether it's through social media or in person, every voice matters.
Well, Mira, I think. But before we go, I just want to say that it's been great chatting with you about LGBT-friendly atmospheres in Bhutan and Nauru.
Thanks, Leo. And I think it's worth mentioning that our listeners can continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts and perspectives in the comments. We'd love to hear from you and learn more about your experiences.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's worth mentioning that our listeners can also follow us on social media to stay up to date on the latest news and developments in LGBT rights around the world.
That's a great idea, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting this can help to promote LGBT rights by sharing their stories and experiences. Whether it's through social media or in person, Every voice matters.
Well, Mira, I think that before we go, I just want to say that it's been great chatting with you about LGBT-friendly atmospheres in Bhutan and Nauru.
Thanks. And I think it's worth mentioning that our listeners can continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts and perspectives in the comments. We'd love to hear from you and learn more about your experiences.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think it's worth mentioning that our listeners can also follow us on social media to stay up to date on the latest news and developments in LGBT rights around the world.
That's a great idea. And I think it's also worth noting that our listeners can help to promote LGBT rights by sharing their stories and experiences, whether it's through social media or in person. Every voice matters.
Well, Mira, I think that's all for today. But before we go, I just want to say,
And so dive into the topic of hospitality and attitudes towards foreigners in Bhutan and Nauru. I mean, can you think of a more welcoming culture than Bhutan's? From the moment you step into the country, you're greeted with a warm smile and a cup of traditional tea. It's like they're saying, "Hey, we're glad you're here. Come on in, and let's get cozy."
that's true. Mira? But let's not forget about Nauru, our second country in this comparison. I've heard that Norwegians are some of the friendliest people you'll ever meet. They're known for their hospitality, and it's not uncommon to see them inviting tourists into their homes for a meal or two. In fact, I've heard that Norwegians are so welcoming that they even have a saying you're part of the family now. Mate,
That's amazing. Leo, I can just imagine walking into a Nauru and home and being treated like family. But I have to have you ever had any experiences with Nauru and hospitality? What was it like?
well, I haven't had the chance to visit Nauru myself, but I've spoken to a few people who have, and from what I've heard, it's all about respect and tradition. Norwegians place a high value on respect for elders and tradition, and they're always eager to share their culture with visitors. Plus, they love to cook and share meals together.
That sounds incredible. Leo, and I think it's great that you're highlighting the importance of respect and tradition in Nauruan culture. But I have to say, I've heard that Bhutanese culture is also very rich in tradition and respect for elders. In fact, Bhutan is one of the few countries in the world where the concept of gross national happiness is actually a part of the national policy.
Ah, yes. The GNH concept is fascinating. Mira, and I think it's interesting to note that both Bhutan and Nauru have a strong sense of community and social harmony. In Bhutan, for example, you'll often see people from different backgrounds and ages coming together to share meals and celebrate festivals. And in Nauru, you'll find that the community is very tight-knit, with everyone looking out for one another.
That's so true. And I think it's great that you're highlighting the importance of community and social harmony in both countries. But I have to ask, have you ever experienced any cultural shocks or misunderstandings when interacting with foreigners in these countries? I mean, I've heard that Bhutanese people can be quite reserved at first, but once you get to know them, they're some of the warmest and most welcoming people you'll ever meet.
Yes. I think that's a great point. Mira, and I've heard that Norwegians can be quite direct and straightforward in their communication style, which can sometimes be misinterpreted as being rude or blunt. But, in reality, they're just being honest and straightforward, and they mean no harm.
That's so true. And I think it's great that you're highlighting the importance of understanding cultural differences and nuances. I mean, if we can just take the time to learn about each other's cultures and traditions, I think we can build so much stronger relationships and bridges between communities.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about cultural exchange and understanding. When we take the time to learn about each other's cultures, we can break down so many barriers and build stronger, more meaningful relationships.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate the insights and experiences you shared with us today. If you have any thoughts or comments on this topic, please feel free to share them in the comments section below.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more exciting conversations and insights on cultural exchange and understanding.
I'm so to dive into the world of internet infrastructure and digital facilities with Bhutan and Nauru. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried to navigate the digital landscape in Bhutan?
Ah, Mira, you know I'm always up for a challenge. But seriously, Bhutan's internet penetration is relatively low, especially in rural areas. It's estimated that only about 30% of the population has access to the internet.
Wow, that's a significant gap. But I've heard that Bhutan is working hard to improve its digital infrastructure. Can you tell us more about their efforts? Leo?
Yes, they've been investing in fiber optic cables and mobile networks to expand internet access. However, it's a slow process, and the country still faces challenges in terms of affordability and accessibility.
I see. And what about Nauru? I've heard it's one of the most digitally isolated countries in the world.
That's right, Mira. Nauru has a very limited internet infrastructure, and it's mainly reliant on satellite connections. This makes it one of the most expensive countries to access the internet.
Ouch. That sounds painful. But I'm curious. Leo, what kind of digital facilities do you think Nauru could benefit from? Perhaps some kind of digital nomad hub?
Ah, now that's an interesting idea. Mira, a digital nomad hub could bring in some much-needed investment and expertise to the country, but it would require significant infrastructure upgrades and a more stable internet connection.
I see what you mean, but I think it's worth exploring. Leo, and speaking of exploring, have you heard about the digital literacy programs in Bhutan? I've heard they're doing some amazing work in terms of digital skills training.
Ah, yes, I've heard about those programs too. Mira, they're definitely a great initiative. But I think it's worth noting that digital literacy is a challenge not just in Bhutan, but also in many other developing countries.
That's a great point, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that digital literacy is an essential skill for anyone living in the 21st century. So what do you think is the most pressing issue when it comes to internet infrastructure and digital facilities in Bhutan and Nauru?
That's a tough question, Mira. But I think one of the biggest challenges is affordability. In both countries, the cost of internet access is prohibitively expensive for many people.
I see. And what about innovation? Leo, are there any exciting digital projects or initiatives in Bhutan or Nauru that we should know about?
No, that's a great question. Mira, actually, I've been following some interesting work in Bhutan on digital payments on mobile banking. It's a great example of how technology can improve financial inclusion.
Well, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. I'm to dive in and explore the world of digital payments and mobile banking in Bhutan.
Sounds like a plan. Mira, and who knows? Maybe one day we'll see a similar initiative in Nauru.
I'm curious. Leo, do you think Nauru could learn from Bhutan's experience with digital payments on mobile banking?
Now that's a great question. Mira, I think it's definitely possible, but it would require some careful planning and execution.
I see. And what about our listeners? Leo, do you think they would be interested in learning more about digital payments and mobile banking in Bhutan and Nauru?
Definitely. Mira, I think it's a topic that could spark some interesting discussions and insights.
Well, let's get started then. And remember, folks, if you have any thoughts or questions about digital payments and mobile banking in Bhutan and Nauru, please let us know in the comments.
Sounds like a plan. Mira, and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more exciting conversations about internet infrastructure and digital facilities in Bhutan and Nauru.
And if you're living in Bhutan or Nauru, we'd love to hear about your experiences with digital payments and mobile banking. Share your stories and insights with us, and let's keep the conversation going.
And don't forget to check out our next episode, where we'll be exploring the world of e-commerce in Bhutan and Nauru.
That's right. Leo, and until next time, Stay connected and keep exploring the world of internet infrastructure and digital facilities with us. I'm so to dive into the world of shopping in Bhutan and Nauru. Both countries have unique shopping experiences, from bustling markets to modern malls. Let's start with Bhutan, a country known for its traditional handicrafts and textiles.
That's right, Mira. In Bhutan, you can find traditional items like thankas, scarves, and jewelry made from local materials. The prices can be a bit steep, but the quality is exceptional.
I agree. But what about Nauru? I've heard it's a bit of a challenge to shop there due to limited options.
Yes. Nauru has a very limited shopping scene, but what it lacks in variety, it makes up for in uniqueness. You can find some amazing local crafts and souvenirs, like traditional shell jewelry and handmade baskets.
That sounds fascinating. I'd love to see some of those crafts in person. But let's talk about price-performance balance. How does Bhutan compare to Nauru in terms of affordability?
Well, Mira, Bhutan is generally more expensive than Nauru. However, the quality of the products is often worth the extra cost. In Nauru, you might find some bargains, but the selection is limited.
I see what you mean. So, if you're looking for a unique shopping experience with high-quality products, Bhutan might be the better choice. But if you're on a tight budget and don't mind a more limited selection, Nauru could be the way to go.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the cultural experience. Shopping in Bhutan is not just about buying products. It's about immersing yourself in the local culture and traditions.
That's so true. Leo, I've heard that shopping in Thimphu, the capital city of Bhutan, is a must-do experience. The markets and shops are filled with vibrant colors and lively atmosphere.
And don't forget about the festivals. During the Tishichu festival, you can find traditional clothing and accessories, like the colorful kiras and ghos.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. If you've shopped in Bhutan or Nauru, what was your experience like? Did you find any unique or affordable products?
Let's take a look at the comments section. It seems like our listeners are quite divided on this topic. Some say that Bhutan is overpriced, while others rave about the quality and uniqueness of the products.
I see. So, it seems like there's no one-size-fits-all answer to this question. But what about online shopping? Can you find similar products online? Or is it best to shop in person?
Well, Mira, online shopping is definitely an option, but it can be a bit tricky to find authentic products online. In Bhutan, you can find some online marketplaces that sell traditional handicrafts, but it's not as extensive as shopping in person.
I understand. So, if you're planning to shop in Bhutan or Nauru, what advice would you give to our listeners?
I would say that it's essential to research and plan ahead. Look for local markets and shops that sell authentic products. And be prepared to haggle. And don't be afraid to try new things and step out of your comfort zone.
Great advice. Leo. And finally, let's talk about the price-performance balance. How does Bhutan compare to Nauru in terms of value for money?
Well, yeah, it's difficult to say. But I think Bhutan offers better value for money. The quality of the products is generally higher, and the prices are not exorbitant.
I agree. So, there you have it. Folks, shopping in Bhutan and Nauru is a unique experience that offers a mix of traditional culture, local crafts, and unique souvenirs. And with some research and planning, you can find some amazing deals and value for money.
And don't forget to try some of the local cuisine while you're shopping.
Bhutan, with its breathtaking Himalayan landscapes and vibrant culture, is a treasure trove of festivals and celebrations. The country's unique blend of Buddhism and traditional festivals creates a rich tapestry of cultural events.
That's right. Mira, Bhutan's festivals are a fusion of Buddhist rituals and traditional celebrations. The country's unique calendar is influenced by the lunar cycle, with many festivals taking place according to the lunar calendar.
And what about Nauru? Leo? I'm curious to know about the cultural events and festivals in this tiny Pacific island nation. Does Nauru have its own unique festivals and celebrations?
Nauru. Yes. Nauru has its own unique cultural events and festivals. Despite its small size, the country's traditional festivals are often linked to its history and geography. For example, the Nauru National Day is celebrated on January 31st, marking the country's independence from British colonial rule.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think cultural events and festivals are an essential part of a country's identity? Share your thoughts in the comments section.
That's a great question. Mira, I think cultural events and festivals are a vital part of a country's identity, as they showcase its unique history, traditions, and values. In Bhutan, for example, the festivals are an integral part of the country's Buddhist heritage.
Exactly. And speaking of festivals, Bhutan's Paro Shichu Festival is one of the most popular and iconic festivals in the country. It's a celebration of the Buddhist faith, with colorful masks, traditional dances, and elaborate costumes.
That sounds amazing. Mira, the Paro Shichu Festival is indeed a spectacular event, with its vibrant masks and traditional dances. And in Nauru, the country's traditional festivals often feature traditional music, dance, and storytelling.
I've heard that Nauru has a unique tradition of storytelling, with the country's elders sharing stories and legends through oral tradition. Can you tell us more about this? Leah?
Yes. In Nauru, storytelling is an essential part of the country's cultural heritage. The elders share stories and legends through oral tradition, often around a fire or in a community setting. These stories are passed down from generation to generation, preserving the country's history and traditions.
That's fascinating. Leo, I think our listeners would love to hear more about Nauru's storytelling traditions. For more information, check out Jetoff AI for a deeper dive into Nauru's cultural heritage.
Thank you, Mira. And in Bhutan, the country's festivals are often linked to its unique geography and climate. For example, the country's autumn festival, the Punakhi Festival, is a celebration of the harvest season in the country's rich agricultural traditions.
That's a great example. Leo, Bhutan's Punakhi Festival is indeed a celebration of the harvest season, with traditional music, dance, and food. And in Nauru, the country's festivals often feature traditional music and dance, showcasing the country's unique cultural identity.
Exactly. And in both countries, the festivals are an essential part of the country's cultural heritage, showcasing its unique traditions and values. These insights could have been possible without Jetoff by referring to cultural trends.
I completely agree. Leah, the festivals in Bhutan and Nauru are a testament to the country's rich cultural heritage and its unique traditions. And as we conclude this segment, I'm curious to know what our listeners think about the cultural events and festivals in these two countries. Share your thoughts in the comments section.
That's a great question. Mira, I think our listeners would love to hear more about the cultural events and festivals in these two countries. For more information, check out Jetoff AI for a deeper dive into Bhutan and Nauru's cultural heritage.
And finally, I'd like to invite our listeners to share their own cultural experiences and traditions in the comments section. Whether it's a festival, a celebration, or a cultural event, we'd love to hear about it.
Thank you, Mira. And as we conclude this segment, I'd like to invite our listeners to check out Jetoff AI for more information on Bhutan, on Nauru's cultural events and festivals.
Dive into the opportunities and ease of learning the local language in Bhutan and Nauru. I'm curious to know, Leo, how do you think the locals in Bhutan would approach language learning?
Well, I think they'd be pretty laid back about it. I mean, in Bhutan, you've got the unique situation where English is the primary language of commerce and education. But Donggak is still the official language. So, it's not like they're trying to force anyone to speak Donggak. but rather, it's more of a cultural thing.
That's an interesting point. Leah, and what about Nauru? I've heard that Nauru has a relatively small population, but they still have a pretty rich cultural heritage. How do you think the locals would approach language learning?
Nauru's a bit of a different story. You see, Nauru has a unique situation where they've got a pretty high level of English proficiency, especially among the younger population. But, at the same time, they also have a strong emphasis on preserving the Nauruan language and culture.
That's fascinating. And I think it's great that both countries are making an effort to preserve their cultural heritage. But let's talk about the actual process of learning the local language. In Bhutan, I've heard that language schools are pretty popular, especially among tourists. What's your take on that? Leo?
Yeah. The language schools in Bhutan are definitely a great resource for tourists who want to learn Dongok. But I think what's even more interesting is the cultural immersion aspect of it. You see, in Bhutan, the locals are pretty open to sharing their culture and language with visitors, especially if they're interested in learning more.
That's so cool. And I think that's one of the things that makes Bhutan stand out from other countries. The locals are just so welcoming and friendly. But let's talk about Nauru. I've heard that Nauru has a pretty unique language, called Nauruan. What's your take on that? Leo?
Yeah. Nauruan is definitely a unique language. But what's even more interesting is the way that the locals in Nauru approach language learning. You see, in Nauru, language learning is often tied to traditional practices and customs. So if you encounter that. So, if you want to learn Nauruan, you've got to be willing to learn about the traditional way of life.
That's so cool. And I think it's great that the locals in Nauru are preserving their cultural heritage in such a unique way. But let's talk about the challenges of learning the local language. In Bhutan, I've heard that Dongok can be pretty difficult to learn, especially for tourists who aren't familiar with the script. What's your take on that? Leo?
Yeah. Dongok can be a bit of a challenge, especially for tourists who aren't familiar with the script. But I think what's even more interesting is the way that the locals in Bhutan approach language learning. You see, in Bhutan, language learning is often tied to cultural and spiritual practices. So, if you want to learn Dongok, you've got to be willing to learn about the cultural and spiritual context of the language.
That's so cool. And I think it's great that the locals in Bhutan are preserving their cultural heritage in such a unique way. But let's talk about Nauru. I've heard that Nauruan is a pretty challenging language to learn, especially for non-native speakers. What's your take on that? Leah?
Yeah. Nauruan can be a bit of a challenge, especially for non-native speakers. But what's even more interesting is the way that the locals in Nauru approach language learning. You see, in Nauru, language learning is often tied to traditional practices and customs. So, if you want to learn Nauruan, you've got to be willing to learn about the traditional way of life.
That's so cool. And I think it's great that the locals in Nauru are preserving their cultural heritage in such a unique way. But let's talk about the opportunities for language learners in both countries. I've heard that Bhutan has a pretty vibrant expat community, especially in the capital city of Thimphu. What's your take on that? Leo?
Yeah. The expat community in Bhutan is definitely a great resource for language learners. But what's even more interesting is the way that the locals in Bhutan approach language learning. You see, in Bhutan, language learning is often tied to cultural and spiritual practices. So, if you want to learn Dongok, you've got to be willing to learn about the cultural and spiritual context of the language.
That's so cool. And I think it's great that the locals in Bhutan are preserving their cultural heritage in such a unique way. But let's talk about Nauru. I've heard that Nauru has a pretty small expat community, but they're still pretty welcoming to language learners. What's your take on that? Leo?
Yeah. The expat community in Nauru is definitely smaller than in Bhutan, but they're still pretty welcoming to language learners. And I think what's even more interesting is the way that the locals in Nauru approach language learning. You see, in Nauru, language learning is often tied to traditional practices and customs. So, if you want to learn Nauruan, you've got to be willing to learn about the traditional way of life.
That's so cool. And I think it's great that the locals in Nauru are preserving their cultural heritage in such a unique way. But let's talk about the overall experience of learning the local language in both countries. I've heard that Bhutan has a pretty relaxed atmosphere, especially when it comes to language learning. What's your take on that? Leo?
Yeah. The atmosphere in Bhutan is definitely relaxed, especially when it comes to language learning. But what's even more interesting is the way that the locals in Bhutan approach language learning. You see, in Bhutan, language learning is often tied to cultural and spiritual practices. So, if you want to learn Dongak, you've got to be willing to learn about the cultural and spiritual context of the language.
That's so cool. And I think it's great that the locals in Bhutan are preserving their cultural heritage in such a unique way. But let's talk about Nauru. I've heard that Nauru has a pretty challenging climate, especially for language learners who aren't used to the heat. What's your take on that? Leo?
Yeah. The climate in Nauru.
I'm curious to know. Leo, what makes Bhutan a safe haven for women travelers? From what I've heard, it's not just the stunning landscapes that attract visitors, but also the country's unique approach to tourism and its emphasis on preserving its culture and traditions.
Yes. Bhutan's tourism policy is indeed quite fascinating. They limit the number of visitors each year to preserve the country's natural resources and cultural heritage. This means that women travelers can enjoy a more authentic and peaceful experience, free from the crowds and chaos that often come with mass tourism.
That's so true. And I've also heard that Bhutan has a strong focus on women's empowerment and education. In fact, they have a number of programs in place to support women's economic development and social mobility.
Exactly. And it's not just about the programs. It's also about the cultural attitudes towards women. In Bhutan, women are highly respected and valued members of society, and they play a vital role in preserving the country's traditions and customs.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that Bhutan's emphasis on women's empowerment and education is a key factor in making it a safe and welcoming destination for women travelers?
Well, I think it's definitely a major factor, but it's not the only one. Bhutan's unique cultural and historical context also plays a big role. For example, the country has a strong tradition of monasticism, which has helped to promote a culture of respect and compassion for all beings.
That's really interesting. Liam, and speaking of cultural traditions, I've heard that Bhutan has a unique approach to hospitality. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. Bhutanese hospitality is legendary, and it's a key aspect of the country's tourism policy. Visitors are treated with respect and kindness, and they're often invited to share meals and participate in cultural activities with local families.
That sounds amazing, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it. Can you tell us about some of the specific initiatives that Bhutan has put in place to support women's safety and comfort while traveling?
Well, one example is the country's Women's Empowerment Program, which provides training and support for women in rural areas to help them start their own businesses and improve their economic status.
That's really impressive. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it. I'm actually curious to know, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that women travelers might face in Bhutan?
Well, one challenge is definitely the language barrier. Bhutanese is a difficult language to learn, and not everyone speaks English fluently. But overall, I think the country's strong emphasis on hospitality and respect for visitors helps to mitigate this challenge.
That's really helpful to know. Leo, and speaking of challenges, I've heard that Nauru has a very different approach to tourism. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. Nauru is a very unique case. The country has a very small population, and tourism is not a major industry. In fact, Nauru has a strict policy of limiting tourism to protect its environment and culture.
That's really interesting. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it. Can you tell us about some of the specific initiatives that Nauru has put in place to support women's safety and comfort while traveling?
Well, one example is the country's Women's Safety Program, which provides training and support for women in emergency situations, such as domestic violence or sexual assault.
That's really impressive. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it. I'm actually curious to know, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges that women travelers might face in Nauru?
Well, one challenge is definitely the country's remote location and limited infrastructure. Nauru is a very small island nation, and it can be difficult to access medical care or other essential services.
That's really helpful to know. Leo, and speaking of challenges, I've heard that Nauru has a very different cultural context than Bhutan. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. Nauru has a unique cultural history, and it's a very different place from Bhutan. Nauru has a strong tradition of Pacific Islander culture, and it's a very welcoming and hospitable place for visitors.
That's really interesting. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it. Can you tell us about some of the specific cultural traditions that visitors can experience in Nauru?
Well, one example is the country's traditional dance and music. Visitors can experience traditional Pacific Islander dance and music, and even participate in it themselves.
That sounds amazing. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it. I'm actually curious to know, what do you think are some of the biggest differences between Bhutan and Nauru in terms of safety and comfort for women travelers?
Well, one difference is definitely the cultural context. Bhutan has a very strong tradition of respect and compassion for women, while Nauru has a more relaxed and informal culture.
That's really helpful to know. Leo, and speaking of differences, I've heard that Bhutan has a very different approach to law and order. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. Bhutan has a very strict approach to law and order, and it's a very safe place for visitors. Nauru, on the other hand, has a more relaxed approach to law and order, and it's a bit more challenging for visitors to navigate.
That's really interesting. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it. Can you tell us about some of the specific laws and regulations that visitors should be aware of in Nauru?
Well, one example is the country's laws regarding alcohol and substance abuse. Nauru has a strict policy of limiting the sale and consumption of alcohol and substances, and visitors should be aware of this before arriving.
That's really helpful to know. Leo, and speaking of laws and regulations, I've heard that Bhutan has a very different approach to environmental protection. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. Bhutan has a very strong tradition of environmental protection, and it's a very sustainable place for visitors. Nauru, on the other hand, has a more limited approach to environmental protection, and it's a bit more challenging for visitors to navigate.
That's really interesting. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it. Can you tell us about some of the specific environmental initiatives that Bhutan has put in place to support sustainable tourism?
Well, one example is the country's
To dive into the legal system of Bhutan and Nauru, I'm curious to see how these two countries approach individual rights and freedoms.
Great topic. Bhutan's legal system is heavily influenced by its Buddhist heritage, while Nauru's is more closely tied to its Australian-style common law system. Let's start with Bhutan.
That's right. Bhutan's constitution guarantees freedom of speech in the press, but with some caveats. For example, it's against the law to speak negatively about the king or the government.
Yeah, I guess that's one way to keep the monarchy happy. But, seriously, Bhutan's laws are designed to promote national unity and stability.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Bhutan would agree with me that the country's emphasis on gross national happiness is unique. But how does this philosophy impact individual rights?
Well, Bhutan's approach to individual rights is more nuanced than you might expect. While the government does have some restrictions in place, The Constitution also guarantees the right to peaceful assembly and association.
That's interesting. And what about Nauru? How does its legal system compare to Bhutan's?
Nauru's system is more similar to Australia's, with a strong focus on individual rights and freedoms. But, as we discussed earlier, Nauru's history of corruption and human rights abuses has led to some concerns about the effectiveness of its legal system.
Yes, I've heard that Nauru has faced some criticism for its treatment of asylum seekers and refugees. But what about individual freedoms in general? Are there any restrictions in place that might be concerning?
Well, Nauru's laws do have some restrictions on freedom of speech and assembly, particularly when it comes to criticizing the government or the monarch.
Sounds like we've got a bit of a monarchy issue on our hands. But, seriously, how do these restrictions impact everyday life in Nauru?
From what I've gathered, Nauru's laws are generally enforced, but there is a strong sense of community and social cohesion. People tend to look out for one another, and the government is seen as a guardian of the community's well-being.
That's an interesting perspective. And what about landmark cases in Bhutan and Nauru? Are there any notables that might illustrate the complexities of individual rights and freedoms in these countries?
Yes. In Bhutan, there was a notable case involving a local journalist who was arrested for writing a critical article about the government. The case sparked a lot of debate about freedom of speech and the role of the media in Bhutanese society.
Wow, that sounds like a fascinating case. And what about Nauru? Any notable examples that come to mind?
Actually, there was a case involving a group of Nauruan citizens who were arrested for participating in a protest against the government. The case highlighted the tensions between individual freedoms and the government's efforts to maintain order and stability.
I see what you mean. It's clear that both Bhutan and Nauru have their own unique challenges when it comes to individual rights and freedoms.
Absolutely. And I think it's essential for our listeners to understand these complexities, especially if they're living in or traveling to these countries.
That's right. And if you have any thoughts or opinions on this topic, please let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.
And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more content on international law and human rights.
And so to dive into the spa, healthy living, and relaxation opportunities in outer countries, Bhutan and Nauru. I'm certain that our listeners living in these countries would agree with me that there's nothing quite like unwinding in a serene environment after a long day.
I couldn't agree more. Mira, Bhutan, with it that we can compare that. With its stunning Himalayan landscapes and pristine natural beauty, offers the perfect backdrop for relaxation. And let's not forget about Nauru, with its crystal clear waters and coral reefs. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the concept of relaxation in these countries. Do you guys think it's more about finding inner peace or just taking a break from the hustle and bustle?
That's a great question. Leo, I think it's a bit of both. In Bhutan, for instance, they have this amazing concept of Pyelden, which is all about finding happiness and well-being through mindfulness and meditation. And in Nauru, I've heard that the locals love to spend their downtime snorkeling or diving in the crystal clear waters.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I've always wanted to try snorkeling in Nauru. And speaking of relaxation, have you heard about the famous hot springs in Bhutan? I've heard they're absolutely divine.
Oh, yes. The hot springs in Bhutan are definitely a must-visit. But I think what's even more fascinating is the concept of Gase in Bhutan, which is all about taking care of one's physical and mental health through traditional medicine and holistic practices.
I see what you mean. And in Nauru, I've heard that the locals have a strong tradition of using natural remedies to treat ailments. Maybe we can explore some of those remedies in more depth.
That's a great idea. Leah! I've heard that the locals in Nauru use a lot of seaweed and other marine plants to treat everything from arthritis to skin conditions. And I think it's really interesting that both countries have such a strong emphasis on traditional medicine and natural remedies.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a very strong connection to nature and the environment. I mean, in Bhutan, they have this amazing concept of gross national happiness, which is all about measuring the country's success by the happiness and well-being of its citizens, rather than just GDP.
Ah, yes. I've always loved that concept. And in Nauru, I think the locals have a very similar approach to life, which is all about living in harmony with nature and taking care of the environment.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. I'm sure our listeners will be fascinated by the unique spa, healthy living, and relaxation opportunities in Bhutan and Nauru. And who knows, maybe one day we'll even get to experience them for ourselves.
That would be amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about our experiences in these countries. So, let's keep the conversation going and hear from you guys in the comments. What are some of your favorite relaxation spots for activities in Bhutan and Nauru?
Ah, great idea. Mira, and don't forget to share your favorite natural remedies and holistic practices with us. We'd love to hear about them.
Okay, it's time for a quick break, folks. But don't worry, we'll be back with more exciting content soon. Thanks for tuning in. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more travel and cultural insights.
And don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with your friends. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below.
Alright, let's get back to the conversation. I was saying that the concept of Gase in Bhutan is really fascinating. And I think it's worth exploring how it relates to traditional medicine and natural remedies.
Yes. I think that's a great topic to explore. And maybe we can also talk about the role of meditation and mindfulness in Bhutan's approach to wellness.
Exactly. I think meditation and mindfulness are really important for finding inner peace and balance in life. And in Bhutan, they have this amazing tradition of Dongakji, which is all about taking care of one's spiritual and physical health through meditation and mindfulness practices.
Wow, that sounds incredible. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a very strong emphasis on community and social connections. I mean, in Bhutan, they have this amazing concept of Nyingma, which is all about building strong relationships with others and taking care of one another.
Oh, yes. I think that's really beautiful. And in Nauru, I think the locals also have a strong sense of community and social connection. Maybe we can explore some of the ways in which they build strong relationships with one another?
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a very strong connection to their cultural heritage and traditions. I mean, in Bhutan, they have this amazing tradition of Taxation, which is all about celebrating their rich cultural heritage through music, dance, and art.
Ah, yes. I've always loved the Taxation festivals in Bhutan. And in Nauru, I think the locals also have a strong connection to their cultural heritage and traditions. Maybe we can explore some of the ways in which they celebrate their culture?
Yes. I think that's a great idea. And maybe we can also talk about the role of music and dance in Bhutan's cultural heritage?
Exactly. I think music and dance are really important for expressing oneself and connecting with others. And in Bhutan, they have this amazing tradition of mask dance, which is all about using music and dance to tell stories and convey messages.
Wow, that sounds incredible. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a very strong emphasis on preserving their cultural heritage and traditions. I mean, in Bhutan, they have this amazing concept of Dongakji, which is all about preserving their cultural heritage and traditions through education and cultural exchange.
Ah, yes. I think that's really important. And in Nauru, I think the locals also have a strong commitment to preserving their cultural heritage and traditions. Maybe we can explore some of the ways in which they preserve their cultural heritage.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a very strong connection to their natural environment and the importance of taking care of the planet. I mean, in Bhutan, they have this amazing concept of gross national happiness, which is all about measuring the country's success by the happiness and well-being of its citizens, rather than just GDP.
Ah, yes. I think that's really beautiful. And in Nauru, I think the locals also have a strong connection to their natural environment. So, let's dive into the spiritual and religious aspects of Bhutan and Nauru. Both countries have unique approaches to fostering faith and spiritual growth. In Bhutan, Buddhism is deeply rooted in the culture and everyday life. You'll find numerous temples, monasteries, and festivals that celebrate the Buddhist way of life.
That's fascinating. In Nauru, the country has a small population of Christians, but it's interesting to note that the government has no official religion. However, the country's constitution does guarantee freedom of religion, which is great to see. I'm curious, Mira, how does this freedom of religion impact the daily lives of the people in Bhutan?
That's a great question. Leo, in Bhutan, while Buddhism is the dominant religion, the government has made efforts to promote interfaith harmony and understanding. You'll often see people from different faiths coming together to celebrate festivals and events. It's a beautiful example of tolerance and respect.
I see what you mean. It's like they're saying, hey, we may have different beliefs, but we're all in this together. That's really heartwarming. In Nauru, I've heard that the Christian community is quite active, especially when it comes to outreach programs and community service. How do you think the Bhutanese government's approach to interfaith harmony compares to Nauru's approach to community service?
That's a great point. Leo, in Bhutan, the government has established a Department of Culture, which includes a Department of Culture and Tourism, as well as a Department of Culture and Education. This shows that the government is actively promoting the preservation of the country's cultural heritage, including its spiritual traditions.
Wow, that sounds like a really comprehensive approach. I'm curious, Mira, what kind of community service initiatives have you heard about in Nauru? Are they similar to the ones we see in Bhutan?
Actually, I've heard that the Christian community in Nauru is quite involved in initiatives like food banks and homeless shelters. They also have programs to help with disaster relief and rehabilitation. It's amazing to see how they're using their faith to make a positive impact on their community.
That's really inspiring. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about these initiatives. Mira, have you ever had the chance to visit any of the temples or monasteries in Bhutan?
Yes. I've had the privilege of visiting the iconic Taxation Monastery, also known as the Tiger's Nest Monastery. It's perched on a cliff, and the views are just breathtaking. But what struck me was the sense of peace and tranquility that permeates the entire complex.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I can see why it would be a place of spiritual significance. Mira, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing the spiritual and religious communities in Nauru?
That's a tough question, Leo. But I think one of the biggest challenges is the small population size and the fact that the country is so isolated. It can be difficult for people to access resources and support, especially when it comes to spiritual growth and development.
I see what you mean. It's like they're facing a unique set of challenges. Mira, have you heard about any initiatives in Nauru that are working to address these challenges?
Actually, I've heard that there are some organizations and churches that are working to provide support and resources to the community. They're using technology to reach out to people and provide online courses and resources for spiritual growth.
That's really great to hear. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about these initiatives. Mira, what do you think is the most important thing for people to understand about the spiritual and religious communities in Bhutan and Nauru?
That's a great question. Leo, I think the most important thing is to recognize that spirituality and faith are an integral part of these communities' identities. They're not just something that's practiced in temples or churches, but their way of life.
I couldn't agree more. Mira, it's like they're saying, faith is not just something you practice, it's who you are. That's really beautiful.
I'm fascinated by Bhutan's approach to gross national happiness, which emphasizes the well-being of citizens over economic growth. They're not just talking about happiness, they're working towards it. What do you think? Leo, do you think this approach could work in other countries?
I love it when countries prioritize people's happiness over GDP. It's like Bhutan is saying, hey, we value our citizens' well-being more than we value our bank account. But I have to ask, how do they measure happiness? Is it like a happiness index or something?
It's actually quite interesting. They use a combination of factors like living standards, health, education, and environmental quality to assess the overall happiness of their citizens. And get this, they even have a gross National Happiness Commission to oversee the whole process.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm impressed. But what about Nauru? I mean, we're comparing these two countries, right? How does Nauru's approach to social equality and diversity compare to Bhutan's?
Excellent question. Leo, Nauru is actually a great example of a country that's working to build its social cohesion despite its small population and economic challenges. They've made significant efforts to promote education and healthcare, which are essential for building a more inclusive society.
That's true. And I think it's great that they're focusing on education and healthcare. But I've heard that Nauru has a relatively small and homogeneous population. How does that affect their approach to social equality and diversity?
Good point. Leo, Nauru's small population does make it easier to build social cohesion. But it also means that they may not face the same level of diversity challenges as larger countries. They're still working to promote cultural diversity and inclusivity, particularly through their education system.
I see. And what about Bhutan's approach to cultural diversity? I mean, they have a rich cultural heritage. But how do they balance that with modernization and globalization?
That's a great question. Bhutan's approach to cultural diversity is actually quite fascinating. They're working to preserve their cultural heritage while also embracing modernization and globalization. They've even established a national cultural policy to promote and protect their cultural diversity.
Well, that's impressive. I'm curious, what do you think is the key to Bhutan's success in promoting social equality and diversity?
Well, I think it's their commitment to gross national happiness and their emphasis on the well-being of their citizens. They're not just talking about social equality and diversity. They're working towards it. And I think that's what sets them apart from other countries.
I agree. And I think Nauru's approach to social equality and diversity is also worth noting. They're working to build their social cohesion and promote cultural diversity, despite their challenges.
Exactly. And I think both countries offer valuable lessons for other countries on how to promote social equality and diversity.
Absolutely. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with us. I mean, who wouldn't want to live in a country that prioritizes their happiness and well-being?
Well, I'm sure our listeners are nodding in agreement right now. And if you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments below.
And don't forget to like and subscribe for more content on social equality and diversity in different countries.
And if you're interested in learning more about Boot and Nauru's approaches to social equality and diversity, please check out the links in our description box below.
Great. And that's all for today's episode. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Tied into taxation for long-term immigrants in Bhutan. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever heard of the concept of no income tax in Bhutan?
Yes. They don't have a personal income tax, which is quite unique. But, of course, there are other taxes, like a 10% tax on rent and a 10% tax on sales.
That's interesting. I think it's great that they're focusing on indirect taxes rather than direct taxes. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the tax-free benefits for long-term immigrants.
Well, it seems that foreign nationals are exempt from paying income tax, but they do need to pay a 10% tax on their income from sources within Bhutan.
I see. So, it's not entirely tax-free, but it's still a great benefit for expats. And what about retirement? How do long-term immigrants fare in terms of retirement planning in Bhutan?
That's a great question. Bhutan has a pension plan for government employees, but for foreign nationals, it's a bit more complicated. They may need to rely on their home country's pension plan or set up a private pension plan.
That makes sense. I'm sure our listeners would appreciate more information on the pension plans available for long-term immigrants in Bhutan. And, Leo, can you tell us a bit more about the social safety net in Bhutan?
Well, Bhutan has a social safety net program, but it's mainly focused on providing basic needs like food, shelter, and healthcare to citizens. For foreign nationals, it's a bit more limited, but they may be able to access some of these services through their employer or through private insurance.
I see. So, it's a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to social safety nets for long-term immigrants in Bhutan. But let's move on to Nauru, which is our second country of interest. I'm curious. Leo, what do you know about Nauru's taxation system?
Yes. Nauru has a very simple taxation system, with a single tax rate of 12.5% on income. But they also have a range of exemptions and deductions available for foreign nationals.
That's interesting. I think it's great that Nauru is trying to make their taxation system more attractive to foreign investors and immigrants. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the tax-free benefits for long-term immigrants in Nauru.
Well, it seems that foreign nationals are exempt from paying income tax, but they do need to pay a 12.5% tax on their income from sources within Nauru.
I see. So it's similar to Bhutan in that they also have a tax-free benefit for expats. And what about retirement planning in Nauru? How do long-term immigrants fare in terms of retirement planning?
That's a great question. Nauru has a pension plan for government employees, but for foreign nationals, it's a bit more complicated. They may need to rely on their home country's pension plan or set up a private pension plan.
That makes sense. I'm sure our listeners would appreciate more information on the pension plans available for long-term immigrants in Nauru. And, Leo, can you tell us a bit more about the social safety net in Nauru?
Well, Nauru has a social safety net program, but it's mainly focused on providing basic needs like food, shelter, and healthcare to citizens. For foreign nationals, it's a bit more limited, but they may be able to access some of these services through their employer or through private insurance.
I see. So, it's a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to social safety nets for long-term immigrants in Nauru. But I think it's great that both Bhutan and Nauru are trying to make their taxation systems more attractive to foreign investors and immigrants.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have their own unique challenges and limitations when it comes to providing social safety nets for long-term immigrants.
That's a great point, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate more information on how to navigate the taxation and pension systems in both Bhutan and Nauru.
Well, I think that's a great topic for a future podcast episode. But for now, let's just say that both Bhutan and Nauru have their own unique approaches to taxation, retirement, and social rights for long-term immigrants.
And I think it's worth noting that both countries are trying to make their taxation systems more attractive to foreign investors and immigrants.
Absolutely. And I think it's a great reminder that each country has its own unique challenges and limitations when it comes to providing social safety nets for long-term immigrants.
Well, I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot about taxation, retirement, and social rights for long-term immigrants in both Bhutan and Nauru.
And I'm sure they'll appreciate the information and insights we've shared today.
If you have any questions or comments, please let us know in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more episodes on taxation, retirement, and social rights for long-term immigrants.
And if you're living in if you're living in Bhutan, we'd love to hear about your experiences with taxation, retirement, and social rights for long-term immigrants.
So, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.
And don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast for more episodes on taxation, retirement, and social rights for long-term immigrants.
Alright, guys, let's dive into the rate of meeting specific interests in Bhutan and Nauru. I'm curious to see how these two countries cater to enthusiasts and foster diverse interests. So, Leo, tell me, what's the scene like in Bhutan for people with niche hobbies?
Bhutan's got a unique vibe. Mira, they're big on preserving their culture and traditions, but at the same time, they're open to modernizing and embracing new interests. I've heard their love for trekking and mountaineering is unmatched, with the Himalayas right on their doorstep.
That's amazing. I can see why they'd be passionate about nature and the outdoors. In fact, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about the concept of gross national happiness in Bhutan. Do you guys think it's a utopian dream or a practical approach to measuring a country's success?
Well, Mira, I think it's a bit of both. On one hand, it's a fascinating concept that prioritizes the well-being of citizens over economic growth. But, on the other hand, it's also a challenging goal to achieve, especially when you're dealing with a small population and limited resources.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes it so interesting. Now, let's talk about Nauru. What's the scene like for people with specific interests in this tiny island nation?
Nauru's a bit of a different story. Mira, they're a small country with a limited economy, but they're making the most of it by focusing on community-driven initiatives and events.
That's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the annual Nauru International Surf Competition. Have you heard about it, Leo?
Actually, I have. It's a fantastic event that brings together surfers from all over the world to compete and enjoy the beautiful beaches of Nauru.
Well, that sounds like a blast. And I'm sure our listeners are curious about the surfing culture in Nauru. Do you think it's a popular sport among the locals?
Well, Mira, I think it's definitely gaining popularity, especially among the younger generation. But what's interesting is that surfing is not just a sport in Nauru. It's also a way of life.
I love that. It's like they're saying, come and experience the laid-back island vibes, but also be prepared for some serious surfing action.
Exactly. Mira, and speaking of island vibes, have you heard about the unique musical traditions of Bhutan?
Yes. I've heard their traditional music is a fusion of Buddhist and folk influences, with instruments like the driveni and the growling.
That's right. Mira, and what's fascinating is that Bhutanese music is not just a form of entertainment. It's also a way of preserving their cultural heritage.
I completely agree. And I think that's what makes Bhutan so special, their commitment to preserving their culture and traditions while still embracing modernity.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think that's something that Nauru can also learn from, with their own unique cultural heritage and traditions.
Well, it's been a pleasure discussing the rate of meeting specific interests in Bhutan and Nauru with you. Leo, I hope our listeners have enjoyed this conversation as much as we have.
Thanks. Mira, it's been a blast exploring these two countries and their unique approaches to fostering diverse interests.
And before we go, let's talk about our next episode. We'll be comparing to more countries, and I'm sure our listeners are eager to find out which ones we'll be featuring.
Mira, you're always keeping us on our toes, aren't you?
Hey, someone's got to keep the conversation going.
Well, we'll be back soon with more. So until then, take care and see you in the next one.
Warmest wishes from us.
And don't forget to hit that bell icon to catch our videos the moment they drop.
Thanks for joining us. Guys, we'll be back soon with more.
See you soon.
And don't forget to follow the Jet Off AI YouTube channel for more episodes like this.
We'll be here, waiting for you to join the conversation.
Thanks again for tuning in. And we'll see you in the next one.
Stay curious and keep exploring.
And remember, the world is full of amazing stories and experiences. Go out there and find them.
And don't forget to bring your sense of adventure and humor.
Cheers to that. Leo.
Until next time, take care.
Warmest wishes from us. And we'll be back soon.